I was hosting the 18 most powerful supply chain executives in the country when my own son stormed into the boardroom and declared that they no longer needed me. He and his wife waited for me to crumble, expecting a broken old man to walk out in shame. What they did not know was that just seconds later, all 18 of those billionaires would stand up and follow me out the door, instantly vaporizing a $3.6 billion merger. And that was only the first domino to fall. My name is Garrison Cole. I am 69 years old, and before I tell you how I dismantled the very people who thought they could bury me, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind someone exactly who built the table they are sitting at. The morning began on the 40th floor of the Titan Freight headquarters. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the Atlanta skyline, a city I had helped keep moving for over 3 decades. I sat at the head of a massive mahogany boardroom table looking at the 18 men and women who controlled the logistics network of North America. We were 10 minutes away from finalizing a $3.6 billion merger that would cement Titan Freight as the undisputed giant of the industry. The air was thick with anticipation and mutual respect. I was just about to hand over the final contracts when the heavy oak doors of the boardroom were shoved open with a violent thud. The sudden noise shattered the professional atmosphere. I stopped speaking and looked up. Marching through the doorway was my 35-year-old son, Kendrick. He was wearing a flashy, custom suit that cost more than his actual business acumen. Right beside him, walking with an air of absolute arrogance, was his wife, Meredith. She was a 32-year-old woman from a declining wealthy family who had always looked down her nose at our roots. Behind them stood 4 private security guards, their hands resting near their belts. The 18 executives at the table fell completely silent, exchanging bewildered glances. I did not raise my voice or show any alarm. I simply folded my hands on the table and waited. Kendrick marched directly to the opposite end of the mahogany table, his chest puffed out like a peacock trying to command a room he had not earned. Kendrick slammed a thick legal folder onto the polished wood right in front of the executives. The loud smack echoed against the glass walls. He looked me dead in the eye and spoke with a loud, rehearsed authority that completely lacked genuine strength. The board of directors has held an emergency vote this morning, Garrison. As of this exact moment, you are officially removed from your position as chairman and CEO of Titan Freight. He pointed a shaking finger at me. You are an obsolete, senile old man holding this company back from the future. Your methods are tired, your mind is slipping, and we can no longer afford to let your deteriorating mental state ruin this enterprise. I felt a collective gasp ripple through the room from the seated guests. To speak to a founder that way, let alone a father, was a display of ultimate disrespect. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his words, Meredith stepped forward. She leaned over the table, her cold blue eyes locking onto mine with venomous satisfaction. It is time for you to pack up your outdated things and leave quietly. Garrison, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. If you try to make a scene or resist this legal transition, I will have security drag you out of this building in front of your esteemed guests. We are taking the reins now. My father, Richard Montgomery, has gracefully agreed to merge Montgomery Global with Titan to provide the sophisticated leadership you clearly lack. She then turned her fake plastic smile toward the 18 executives, attempting to charm them. Gentlemen and ladies, please do not be alarmed. The $3.6 billion merger is completely safe. You are simply dealing with a more refined, capable generation of management now. My husband and I are ready to sign the paperwork and move Titan Freight into a much more lucrative era. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. They stood there waiting for my reaction, expecting me to scream, to beg, to fight for my legacy. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted to humiliate me. I did not yell. I did not argue. I sat there in total stillness, looking at the 2 traitors before me. I looked at Kendrick and his soft, perfectly manicured hands. A flash of memory crossed my mind. I remembered being 34 years old, standing in an abandoned, rat-infested warehouse in South Atlanta. My hands were calloused, cracked, and bleeding from clearing debris for 18 hours straight. Beside me was my late wife, Yvonne, working by the light of a single flickering bulb, keeping track of our pennies in a worn notebook. We built Titan Freight from a single rusty delivery truck into a global empire with our own sweat, blood, and undeniable grit. Kendrick inherited the penthouse, but he never knew the pavement. He had no idea what it actually took to command a room of wolves. I felt a cold, absolute clarity wash over me. The love I had for my son was instantly eclipsed by the sheer reality of his betrayal. He had let a toxic woman and her bankrupt family turn him against his own blood. I slowly reached for my leather briefcase. I placed my personal pens inside, closed the lid, and snapped the brass lock shut. The sharp metallic click was the only sound in the room. I stood up slowly, buttoning my suit jacket. I looked at the 18 executives around the table, making brief eye contact with each of them. We had done business for years, we had weathered economic storms together, and we knew the true value of loyalty. I did not say a single word in my own defense. I simply nodded to them and said, "Gentlemen, ladies, it seems my time here is done. Have a good afternoon." I turned my back on my son and began walking calmly toward the boardroom doors. Kendrick smiled broadly, looking incredibly smug. Meredith smirked, crossing her arms in victory, but their triumph lasted exactly 3 seconds. As I took my 5th step, the CEO of the largest shipping conglomerate in North America silently closed his leather portfolio and stood up. Then the executive beside him stood up, then another and another. Chairs scraped against the hardwood floor. Within 10 seconds, all 18 of the most powerful executives in the room rose from their seats. They did not look at Kendrick. They completely ignored Meredith and her forced smile. They picked up their briefcases and walked right past the security guards, following me out the door in total unified silence. The color drained from Kendrick's face instantly. "Wait," he stammered, his voice cracking with sudden panic. "Where are you going? The merger is still on. We can offer you better terms. Please sit back down." But the executives kept walking, leaving Kendrick and Meredith standing completely alone in a massive empty room with a worthless piece of paper. The $3.6 billion deal was instantly dead. As I stepped into my private elevator, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a furious text message from Meredith. "You arrogant old fool, you just cost us billions. Check your accounts right now. I had the board freeze all your personal assets this morning. You have absolutely nothing left." I looked at the message as the elevator doors slid shut, and I just smiled. The drive from downtown Atlanta to my private estate in Buckhead was usually a quiet transition from the corporate battlefield to my personal sanctuary. Today I steered my classic sedan through the winding oak-lined streets with my mind actively calculating the exact legal maneuvers required to completely decapitate the board of directors. I pulled up to the massive wrought iron gates of my home and rolled down my window. I punched my private entry code into the keypad. The small digital screen flashed a harsh red light. Access denied. I typed it again, pressing the keys firmly. The system rejected it a second time. I looked through the thick iron bars at the sprawling property. Sitting right in the middle of the perfectly manicured green lawn was a piece of luggage. It was my old scuffed leather suitcase, the exact same vintage bag I had carried on my very first cross-country sales trips 30 years ago. It had been thrown over the fence like common garbage. A few of my tailored dress shirts and a pair of expensive shoes were scattered carelessly across the damp grass. My own son had not just locked me out of my company. He had locked me out of the home I built from scratch and discarded my belongings like street trash. I parked the car on the curb and stepped out. The evening air was crisp, but I felt an intense heat rising in my chest. I walked up to the heavy iron gate and stood there looking at my scattered clothes. This was a highly calculated insult designed specifically to provoke an emotional reaction. They wanted me to yell, to bang my fists on the metal, to act like a desperate, defeated man. I did none of those things. I simply stood straight and waited. I knew someone was watching from the shadows. The massive mahogany double doors of the mansion swung open. Meredith stepped out onto the grand portico. She walked slowly down the stone pathway toward the gate, holding a crisp white legal document in her hand. But it was not the document that caught my immediate attention. It was what she was wearing. She was draped in an emerald green silk robe. It was not hers. It belonged to Yvonne. I had bought that exact robe for my wife during a trip to Milan to celebrate our 20th wedding anniversary. Yvonne used to wear it on Sunday mornings while drinking coffee on the terrace, looking out at the gardens we planted together. Now this arrogant woman was wearing my late wife's cherished garment, parading it in front of me as a twisted trophy of her conquest. Meredith stopped on the other side of the iron gate, a sickeningly sweet smile plastered across her face. "Do you like the new security protocols, Garrison?" she asked, running a hand down the luxurious silk fabric of the robe. Kendrick decided it was time to upgrade everything. He also decided that your continued presence here is a major liability to our new image. She pressed the document against the iron bars so I could read the bold print. It was a comprehensive power of attorney. Kendrick had signed it, granting Meredith and her father, Richard Montgomery, complete administrative control over the estate and all affiliated domestic properties. My husband is the actual CEO now, she stated, her voice dripping with venomous pride and unearned superiority. He has full legal authority over all the family assets. This house is officially under the management of Montgomery Global. We are going to completely remodel this outdated museum starting tomorrow morning. You are currently trespassing on private property. Take your pathetic little vintage bag and leave this neighborhood immediately. If I see your car parked on this street in exactly 5 minutes, I am calling the police and pressing charges for criminal harassment. You are completely finished, Garrison. You have no company, no money, and no home. Go find a cheap motel and rot quietly while we fix the mess you left behind. I stared at the emerald silk robe brushing against the cold iron gate. A violent storm of fury raged in my blood. Every primal instinct I possessed urged me to shatter the electronic lock, walk straight through those gates and tear that sacred garment off her shoulders. But blind rage is a tool for the weak. Absolute discipline is the weapon of a king. I kept my face entirely devoid of emotion. She desperately wanted to see pain, but I gave her a stone statue. She was painfully ignorant of how real wealth actually functioned in the real world. I bought this land when Yvonne and I made our first $1 million. We laid the foundation stones ourselves. Legally, this entire estate was anchored deep within the Cole family irrevocable trust. Kendrick might be the current acting CEO of the logistics company, but he was absolutely nothing but a temporary paper trustee when it came to the family estate. He lacked the fundamental legal authority to transfer management to his wife's bankrupt family. The impressive-looking document Meredith was holding against the gate was a legally worthless piece of paper. But I was not going to give her a free law lesson standing on the sidewalk. Let them firmly believe they had conquered the castle. Let them throw parties, drink my wine, and celebrate their stolen kingdom. When a lethal trap is carefully set, you do not warn the mouse about the cheese. I did not give Meredith the satisfaction of a single spoken word. I turned my back on her smug face, walked over to the grass, and picked up my leather suitcase. I calmly gathered my scattered shirts, folded them neatly, and placed them inside the bag. I walked back to my car, put the luggage in the trunk, and slid into the driver's seat. I started the engine and drove away, leaving my home in the rearview mirror without a second glance. As I merged onto the highway, I picked up my phone and dialed a highly secure line. Evelyn Pierce answered on the second ring. She was a 45-year-old corporate shark, a brilliant attorney who had navigated my most complex acquisitions for the past 15 years. She was the only person in Atlanta who knew exactly where all my financial bodies were buried. Garrison, she answered, her tone sharp and immediately alert. I heard about the boardroom coup. The financial wires are already buzzing with rumors. Kendrick and his wife just locked me out of the Buckhead estate, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. They think they have seized the trust. Let them have their delusion for the weekend. I need you to bypass the corporate freeze and activate my private offshore retirement accounts. We are going to need immediate capital to launch a massive counteroffensive. I want to bleed Montgomery Global dry by Monday morning. There was a heavy, prolonged silence on the other end of the line. The kind of dead silence that always precedes a major disaster. Evelyn never hesitated. Garrison, her voice was uncharacteristically tight and strained. I just checked the Cayman routing numbers 10 minutes ago when I saw the corporate accounts locked down. I thought you had moved the capital to a secondary shell company. Moved what, I asked, my grip tightening on the leather steering wheel. The $50 million, Evelyn said, her words landing like physical blows. Your entire personal retirement fund. It is completely gone, Garrison. The account has been drained to zero. Every single cent has been wired out. I drove straight to the Waldorf Astoria in Midtown. Evelyn had already secured a private penthouse suite under a corporate pseudonym I rarely used to ensure complete anonymity. When I walked through the heavy wooden door, she was sitting at the glass dining table, illuminated only by the harsh blue light of her laptop screen. I dropped my old leather suitcase onto the marble floor and walked over to stand behind her. There it was, in digital ink. The offshore retirement account I had spent 20 years quietly building was completely drained. $50 million of pure liquid capital wiped out, leaving a balance of absolute zero. Evelyn ran her hands through her dark braids, her usually unshakable composure cracking just a fraction. Garrison, the security protocols on this account were biometric and dual authenticated, she said, her voice tight with disbelief. Someone had to have physically bypassed the primary server and forged your digital authorization. I stared at the zeros on the screen, feeling a cold, calculated anger replacing the initial shock. Kendrick knew about the fail-safe protocols. I taught him the architecture of our financial security systems myself when I mistakenly believed he was actually capable of running Titan Freight. He used the administrative overrides I built to protect us to rob me blind. I poured myself 2 fingers of neat bourbon from the minibar. I did not take a sip. I just held the heavy glass, feeling the ice melt against my palm. We need to find out exactly where that capital landed, I commanded. If my son thinks he can steal a $50 million war chest and hide it in his own backyard, he is vastly underestimating the tools at our disposal. Evelyn did not need to be told twice. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up encrypted financial tracking software that only a handful of elite corporate attorneys possessed. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen as she ran a deep trace on the routing numbers. A sudden transaction of that magnitude leaves a massive digital footprint, no matter how well you try to scrub the ledger. It took her precisely 14 minutes to break through the first layer of shell accounts. She leaned closer to the screen, her eyes narrowing. "Garrison," she said, pointing a perfectly manicured nail at a string of offshore routing codes. The capital did not go into any of Kendrick's personal accounts. It did not go into the Titan Freight corporate reserves either. He bypassed his own financial infrastructure entirely. I set the glass of bourbon down on the table with a sharp clink. "Where is my money, Evelyn?" She tapped a few more keys, decrypting the final destination. It was wired through 3 different international clearinghouses before dropping into a blind trust registered in the Cayman Islands. But the trust is not blind to me. I know the holding structure. It belongs to Apex Horizon Holdings. I recognized the name immediately. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Apex Horizon was not a Titan Freight subsidiary. It was the primary offshore umbrella company for Montgomery Global. Richard Montgomery, Meredith's father, the man whose own domestic empire had been quietly bleeding cash for the past 5 years due to catastrophic real estate investments and gross mismanagement. Kendrick did not steal my retirement to fund his own ambitions. He stole my life savings to bail out his arrogant father-in-law. Richard Montgomery was drowning in corporate debt, and my son had just handed him a $50 million life raft stolen directly from my vault. Meredith had played my son flawlessly. She married a man eager to prove himself and manipulated his deep-seated insecurities until he was willing to commit federal wire fraud to impress her bankrupt family. She had convinced him that saving her father was the ultimate power move. In reality, she was just treating Kendrick like a disposable wallet. The $50 million was not a business investment. It was a ransom he willingly paid to keep a woman who secretly despised his lack of spine. The entire picture snapped into brutal focus. Kendrick was not a mastermind staging a brilliant corporate coup. He was a pathetic puppet dancing on strings pulled by his wife and her desperate father. He had traded his birthright and his own father for a pat on the head from a family that secretly laughed at his incompetence behind closed doors. They used his executive authority to drain my accounts and seize my properties, leaving him exposed to all the legal liability while they hoarded the actual cash. I felt a sudden dark wave of pity for my son, quickly followed by an absolute, ruthless resolve. They thought taking my liquid capital would leave me defenseless. They completely forgot that I am the man who engineered the entire logistic ecosystem they were trying to steal. "Evelyn," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper, "contact the Federal Banking Oversight Commission immediately. Do not file a formal fraud claim yet. Just initiate a silent trace on Apex Horizon Holdings. Let Richard Montgomery feel safe for the weekend. Let him start spending my money. When a thief thinks he has gotten away clean, he gets sloppy. We are going to build a legal cage so tight around the Montgomery family that they will beg me to lock the door. We will let them hang themselves with their own greed. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of corporate warfare with a man who wrote the rulebook. Before Evelyn could pick up her phone to make the call, my personal cell phone buzzed violently against the glass table. The caller ID flashed Kendrick's name. I did not answer. I let it ring, echoing through the quiet luxury of the penthouse until it clicked over to voicemail. 10 seconds later, an audio file and an image attachment dropped into my inbox. I opened the audio file and put the phone on speaker. Kendrick's voice filled the room, sounding manic and breathless, a stark contrast to his fake bravado in the boardroom. Listen to me carefully, old man, he sneered, his voice trembling with forced aggression. Meredith told me about the little stunt you pulled at the front gate. You think you can just walk away and plot some kind of revenge. You think you have options. You have absolutely nothing. Do not try to contact your lawyers. Do not try to fight the board. If you make a single move to sue me for the retirement funds or contest the estate transfer, I will legally destroy what is left of your life. I tapped the image attachment. A high-resolution scan filled my screen. It was an official-looking medical document bearing the letterhead of a prominent Atlanta psychiatric clinic. I read the bold text at the top, Certificate of Severe Cognitive Decline and Advanced Dementia. At the bottom was a forged signature of a doctor I had never met certifying that I was a complete danger to myself and entirely incapable of managing my own affairs. Kendrick's voice message continued dripping with malice. Look at the file, Garrison. I have 3 medical professionals ready to testify that you are completely out of your mind if you do not disappear quietly and let us run Titan Freight. I will have a judge sign an emergency mandate. I will have you forcibly committed to a state-run mental facility before Monday morning. You will spend the rest of your miserable life locked in a padded room eating pureed food while Meredith and I spend your billions. The recording clicked off. I stared at the forged medical certificate as a terrifying knock suddenly pounded against my hotel room door. The aggressive knocking rattled the heavy mahogany door of the penthouse. I did not flinch. I motioned for Evelyn to step into the shadow of the hallway out of immediate sight. I walked calmly to the door and looked through the brass peephole. Standing in the brightly lit corridor were 2 uniformed Atlanta police officers. Flanking them were 2 men wearing clinical white coats, carrying a heavy medical bag and a folded canvas stretcher. They looked less like medical professionals and more like hired muscle. "Open the door, Mr. Cole," one of the officers shouted, his voice echoing down the empty hall. "We have a court-mandated psychiatric extraction order. You need to come with us immediately." Kendrick and Meredith had not wasted a single second. They tracked my location through some backdoor corporate channel and sent their fabricated medical strike team to drag me away in the middle of the night. If I opened that door and showed even a hint of anger or resistance, they would use it as absolute proof of my supposed hostility and mental decline. They wanted a struggle. They wanted to inject me with sedatives, strap me to a gurney, and make me disappear into the darkest wing of a state facility. I took a deep breath, centering my heart rate. I adjusted the cuffs of my suit jacket and unlocked the deadbolt. I pulled the door open just wide enough to stand in the frame, blocking their entry. "Good evening, gentlemen," I said, my voice projecting total authority. "I assume you have a legally binding reason for disturbing my privacy." The lead officer stepped forward, resting his hand on his utility belt. He held up a clipboard. "We have an emergency mandate signed by a superior court judge. We are here to escort you to a psychiatric evaluation facility for your own safety." I did not step aside. Instead, I smoothly pulled my phone from my breast pocket, tapped the screen, and activated a live video broadcast connected directly to Evelyn's secure legal cloud. The red recording light blinked steadily. "For my own safety and the legal integrity of this interaction, I am recording this encounter," I stated, holding the camera at eye level to capture the faces of the officers and the 2 men in white coats. "You are currently standing in a private residence attempting to execute an involuntary medical hold on a citizen with 0 history of mental illness. I want to see the exact paperwork you are holding, officer." The policeman looked slightly uncomfortable at the sight of the camera, but held out the clipboard. I scanned the document. It was an emergency order of apprehension. I looked at the bottom of the page. The primary petitioner listed was my daughter-in-law, Meredith Cole. The medical affidavit attached was signed by the exact same fictitious doctor from Kendrick's email attachment. This order is based on a fabricated medical affidavit filed less than 2 hours ago by a woman who has no legal medical proxy over me, I said, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. Furthermore, this mandate requires a mandatory 48-hour observation period before any judge can authorize a forced extraction. You are attempting to bypass standard legal procedure based on a forged document provided by a hostile family member currently under investigation for corporate fraud. The 2 men in white coats shifted nervously. One of them reached for the door frame. "Mr. Cole, you are exhibiting signs of paranoia," he said, attempting to sound clinical. "We need you to come with us voluntarily, or we will be forced to use physical restraints." I shifted my gaze to the man in the white coat, my eyes cold and unyielding. "You are not a state-appointed medical official," I noted, reading the logo on his badge. "You represent a private boutique clinic heavily funded by Montgomery Global. If you take one step across this threshold without a verified state warrant, I will have my legal counsel press charges for attempted kidnapping and aggravated assault." Evelyn stepped out of the shadows, holding her own phone recording from a secondary angle. "I am Evelyn Pierce, senior legal counsel for Mr. Cole," she announced, her tone like shattered glass. "Be advised that every second of this illegal intrusion is being documented. If you lay a hand on my client, I will personally ensure you lose your badges and your medical licenses by tomorrow morning." The lead officer hesitated. He looked at Evelyn, then back at my steady, unwavering camera. The sheer confidence we projected was completely contradicting the narrative of a confused, senile old man. "Sir, we are just following a judge's order," the officer said, his aggressive posture deflating. "If you refuse to comply, we will have to call for backup." "You will not need backup," I said smoothly, reaching into my inner jacket pocket. I pulled out a thick, legally notarized envelope bearing the official gold-embossed seal of the National Institutes of Health. I unfolded the heavy parchment and held it up to the camera before handing it directly to the officer. 2 days ago, in preparation for a $3 billion corporate merger, I underwent a comprehensive cognitive and physical evaluation by 3 independent federally appointed neurologists, I explained. "Read the conclusion, officer." The policeman scanned the document. His eyes widened as he read the signatures of the top medical professionals in the country. The document certified that my cognitive function, memory, and psychological stability were in the top 1 percentile for my age group. It was an absolute, legally bulletproof, clean bill of health. This federal certification completely supersedes your local emergency petition, which was filed by a private citizen with an obvious financial conflict of interest, I stated. "You have been weaponized by my son to execute a corporate coup." The officer swallowed hard, realizing the massive legal liability he had just walked into. He handed the federal document back to me and turned to the 2 men in white coats. "We are done here," he said sharply. "The state order is superseded by federal medical clearance. Pack up your gear." The fake medical team tried to argue, but the officer cut them off. "I said we are leaving right now." I stood in the doorway and watched as they retreated down the hallway, taking their canvas stretcher and their sedatives with them. I closed the heavy door and locked the deadbolt. Evelyn let out a long breath and lowered her phone. "That was dangerously close, Garrison. Meredith has judges in her pocket. They are moving faster than I anticipated. We need to strike back immediately before they find another corrupt official to sign a different warrant." I nodded, walking back to the dining table. "I am done playing defense, Evelyn. It is time to burn their house down." I sat down in front of her laptop. Kendrick was foolish enough to send me the forged psychiatric certificate directly from his personal phone. It was the absolute smoking gun we needed. I was going to forward the audio recording of his extortion threat and the forged medical document directly to my contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Submitting false documents to a federal court to seize assets was a severe felony. I opened my encrypted email client and attached the files. I quickly typed out a direct message to the regional director of the White Collar Crime Division outlining the wire fraud and the attempted medical kidnapping. I moved the cursor to the send button. Just as my finger pressed down on the trackpad, the screen violently flickered. A harsh line of green code ripped across the display. Then the entire monitor went pitch black. I hit the keyboard, but the machine was completely unresponsive. Evelyn rushed over and grabbed her secondary tablet from her briefcase. Her face went pale. "Garrison," she whispered, her voice dropping with absolute horror. "Our connection is gone. It is not just the local network." I grabbed my phone. The signal bars were completely dead. The screen flashed a fatal error message. "Administrator access permanently revoked." I looked back at the dead laptop screen. Kendrick and Meredith had not just locked me out of the building. They had utilized the company mainframe to launch a massive targeted cyber wipe. Every single one of my private emails, every digital contract, every piece of secure server data I held at Titan Freight was being systematically deleted in real time. They were completely erasing my 30-year legacy from the digital world. I sat in the darkness of the hotel room, staring at the black screen, realizing my son was actively trying to erase my entire existence. The digital blackout lasted through the night, but by morning the real reason for their cyber attack was broadcast on every major financial news network. I stood in the living room of the penthouse staring at the massive flat-screen television. The breaking news banner flashing across the bottom of the screen read, "Titan Freight announces historic restructuring." There was Kendrick standing behind a polished podium at the Atlanta Convention Center looking like a little boy playing dress-up in his tailored suit. Meredith was standing just off to the side clapping with a serene, rehearsed smile alongside her father, Richard Montgomery. Kendrick grabbed the microphone and looked out at the sea of financial journalists with profound arrogance. "Today marks the dawn of a new era for Titan Freight," he declared, his voice echoing through the speakers. "For too long, this company has been held back by antiquated leadership and obsolete visions. Effective immediately, the board of directors has authorized the sale of a 51% controlling stake in Titan Freight to Montgomery Global." The flashbulbs erupted in a blinding cascade. Kendrick puffed out his chest, soaking in the unearned validation from the crowd. He went on to explain how this strategic merger would inject fresh capital and sophisticated management into the logistics giant I had built. He was lying through his teeth to the entire world. There was no fresh capital anywhere in sight. Montgomery Global was drowning in massive corporate debt. Kendrick was essentially giving away the keys to my kingdom for pennies on the dollar just to buy a seat at his father-in-law's sinking table. He was looting his own legacy to appease a wife who would throw him to the wolves the second his pockets were empty. I watched the screen with a completely steady heart rate. Evelyn stood next to me, her arms crossed tight against her chest. "He is giving them a majority stake for a fraction of its actual market value," she said, her voice laced with pure professional disgust. "It is an absolute corporate fire sale, Garrison. He is deliberately crashing the valuation just to push the deal through before the market realizes Montgomery Global is functionally insolvent." I kept my eyes locked on Kendrick's smug face on the television. My own flesh and blood was selling out my entire life of grueling work just to secure a fake sense of superiority. He wanted to be the man of the hour so desperately that he did not care if the ship was sinking as long as he was the one holding the wheel. He looked at the cameras with such pathetic arrogance, believing he had completely checkmated me by freezing my bank accounts and erasing my digital footprint. He thought that because he sat in the corner office and held the administrative passwords, he actually owned Titan Freight. He thought the company was just a collection of trucks, warehouses, shipping containers, and delivery routes. Kendrick was a fool who only understood the superficial layers of wealth. He never bothered to look beneath the floorboards to see the foundation holding the entire structure together. He did not understand that Titan Freight was not just a fleet of physical vehicles. Titan Freight was a highly advanced algorithm. It was a highly specialized artificial intelligence architecture that predicted supply chain disruptions, optimized routing in real time, and managed billions of moving parts globally without human intervention. That was the true value of the company. That was the invisible engine that made the $3 billion valuation possible in the modern market. And my deeply arrogant son had absolutely no idea who actually owned that engine. He assumed the corporate entity possessed every single asset because he never read the founding documents. He was parading around on stage selling a mansion while entirely oblivious to the fact that he did not own the land it was built on. 30 years ago, long before we had corporate towers and thousands of employees, I sat at a cheap folding table in a dusty garage. Yvonne was asleep on the couch nearby, having just finished a double shift to keep the lights on for us. I stayed awake for 3 days straight, fueled by black coffee and sheer desperation, writing the original source code for our logistical tracking software. I built the operational matrix from scratch, line by line, testing every variable. When the software was finally perfected, I made a very quiet, very specific legal decision. I did not patent the breakthrough technology under the name Titan Freight. I patented the core algorithm entirely under my own personal name, Garrison Cole. As the company grew into a multi-billion-dollar empire, the board of directors just assumed the intellectual property belonged to the corporate entity. But Evelyn and I had drafted an ironclad perpetual licensing agreement years ago. Titan Freight was merely renting my brain on a strict contractual basis. I legally owned the beating heart of the entire global network. Kendrick could lock me out of the headquarters. He could erase my corporate emails. He could even sell 51% of the trucks and the physical warehouses to Richard Montgomery. But he could never sell the code. "Turn off the television," I told Evelyn without taking my eyes off the screen. "We have an appointment to make." I grabbed my suit jacket and headed for the door. We did not go to a bank or a courtroom. We drove straight to the regional headquarters of the United States Copyright Office. I walked past the security checkpoints with my physical patent documents safely secured in a fireproof briefcase. These were authentic paper documents Kendrick could never delete because they existed long before he even learned how to type. Evelyn walked beside me, her briefcase packed with the original licensing contracts. We sat down in a secure meeting room with the senior federal intellectual property registrar. I placed the original patent filing on the table. My son is attempting to sell a controlling stake in a company that relies entirely on my proprietary software, I explained to the federal agent. I am officially invoking the termination clause in the Titan Freight licensing agreement due to hostile corporate restructuring. Evelyn slid the legal revocation notice across the polished wood. This is the poison pill. Once the registrar stamped that document, a legally binding shockwave was sent directly to the Titan Freight mainframe. The software license was officially revoked. The poison pill had a mandatory grace period designed to prevent immediate catastrophic supply chain collapse across the country. It gave the company exactly 72 hours to cease all operations using my algorithm. 72 hours until the entire logistical network of Titan Freight went completely dark. Kendrick and Meredith were busy popping champagne bottles and celebrating their fraudulent victory at the convention center. They were posing for magazine covers, completely unaware of the invisible guillotine hanging over their necks. They had no idea that they had just purchased a massive multi-billion-dollar vehicle with absolutely no engine inside. I walked out of the federal building into the bright Atlanta sunlight and looked at my gold watch. The countdown had officially started. In exactly 3 days, the entire empire they stole would crumble to dust in their hands. The Montgomery Global Acquisition Gala was held in the grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel. It was a sickening display of unearned wealth and premature celebration. Crystal chandeliers illuminated a massive room filled with Atlanta high society, all sipping premium champagne paid for by the very company they were currently driving into the ground. I did not have a formal invitation, but when you carry yourself like you own the building, doors simply tend to open for you. I walked past the velvet ropes wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that fit me like a second skin. The lively chatter in the grand room began to die down the exact moment I stepped onto the polished marble floor. It started as a subtle ripple of hushed whispers and quickly cascaded into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Hundreds of curious eyes turned toward me. They expected to see a defeated old man broken and humiliated by his own son's ruthless corporate coup. Instead, they saw the original founder of Titan Freight standing tall with absolute calm radiating from every single step. I walked slowly and deliberately through the crowd, parting the sea of expensive silk gowns and tailored designer suits. Waiters froze in their tracks, holding their silver trays perfectly still. I kept my gaze locked straight ahead, focused entirely on the VIP table situated at the center of the room. There sat Richard Montgomery, soaking in his fraudulent victory. Beside him was Meredith, dripping in diamonds, and Kendrick holding a glass of vintage champagne. The triumphant smile on my son's face vanished the second he saw me approaching. His hand trembled slightly, causing the golden liquid in his glass to ripple. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "What are you doing here?" Kendrick demanded, his voice cracking with a messy mixture of genuine fear and forced public authority. He frantically waved his free hand toward the perimeter of the expansive room. "Security! Get security over here right now. This man is trespassing on a private event." Two burly men wearing dark suits and earpieces started to jog toward us from the entrance, but I simply held up a single hand. The gesture carried decades of absolute corporate authority, and the guards instinctively hesitated, stepping back into the shadows. I stepped right up to Kendrick, completely invading his personal space. I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath and clearly see the faint sheen of cold sweat forming on his forehead. "You do not need security, son," I said, keeping my voice incredibly low and perfectly even. "I am not here to ruin your little celebration or make a public scene. I am just here to deliver a highly personal message." I reached smoothly into the inner breast pocket of my tuxedo jacket. Kendrick flinched visibly, bracing his body as if I was about to pull out a weapon right in front of the crowd. Instead, I pulled out a single folded piece of paper. It was a highly sensitive financial document that Evelyn had uncovered just a few hours ago through her deep network of underground forensic accountants. I smoothly slid the paper directly into the breast pocket of Kendrick's suit jacket, adjusting his silk lapel with a firm, condescending pat. He stared at me completely bewildered. I leaned in extremely close so only he could hear the heavy words leaving my mouth. You should be much more careful about where you borrow your operational cash, Kendrick. You looted my retirement to save your father-in-law's failing company, but you still had a massive liquidity gap to cover Meredith's extravagant lifestyle and keep up appearances. So you went straight to the shadow market. You borrowed $20 million from the Petrov syndicate to balance your personal books. Did you really think you could take out a black market loan of that magnitude and hide it from me? The Petrovs do not care about your fancy new CEO title. They do not care about your shiny board of directors or this gala. They only care about collection. And their collection methods are usually extremely violent and entirely unforgiving. All the color instantly drained from Kendrick's face. He looked absolutely terrified, his jaw slacking as the brutal reality of his hidden nightmare was suddenly exposed to the light. He reached a trembling hand toward his breast pocket, feeling the folded paper like it was a live grenade ready to detonate. Before he could formulate a single word, Meredith aggressively stepped between us. She puffed out her chest, attempting to shield her pathetic husband and salvage the public spectacle. "Security, remove this man from the premises!" She shrieked, her voice echoing sharply across the silent, breathless ballroom. She turned to the crowd, projecting her words loudly to ensure every single person heard her. "Look at this pathetic display. You just cannot accept that your relevant time is over, Garrison. You think putting on a nice tuxedo covers up what you truly are. You are nothing but a glorified truck driver from the dirty, impoverished streets of South Atlanta. You belong in a filthy, oil-stained warehouse, not in a corporate boardroom, and certainly not in a room with refined high society. We elevated your little shipping company into a sophisticated global enterprise. We gave it actual class. Now take your ghetto mentality and get out before I have you thrown in the back of a police cruiser like a common criminal." She glared at me with absolute disdain, her chin raised high as she waited for the crowd to validate her cruel outburst. She was desperate to humiliate me, to prove that her bloodline was inherently superior to mine. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting for my reaction to her venomous racial and classist insults. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice in anger. I simply looked at her with a cold, terrifying amusement that completely unsettled her stance. I stepped closer to Meredith, bypassing her protective posture entirely. I leaned down and brought my lips right next to her ears so no one else could hear the devastation I was about to unleash. "Class is something you are born with, Meredith." I whispered, my tone razor-sharp and chillingly calm. "It is not something you can buy with stolen money. Speaking of stolen money, I hope the Zurich branch of the Alpine Continental Bank is treating you well. Account number 7492. Her entire body went rigid, as if she had just been struck by lightning. I continued my whisper, feeling her begin to physically shake. "Did you really think you could siphon $50 million of my stolen retirement funds into a secret Swiss account without me noticing? You are actively starving your husband's new company to build your own personal offshore divorce fund. You are planning to drain Kendrick dry and abandon him to the violent loan sharks the exact second the Titan merger is legally finalized. You are playing him for an absolute fool, but you cannot play me. I already used my original asset documentation to freeze the Zurich account this afternoon, Meredith. You have absolutely nothing left." I pulled back and looked her dead in the eyes. The smug, arrogant expression had been completely wiped from her pale face, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out of her throat. The pristine crystal wine glass slipped from her trembling fingers. It hit the marble floor with a loud, sharp crash, shattering into 100 glittering pieces across the silent ballroom. The dark red wine splashed across the hem of her expensive designer gown, looking exactly like fresh blood. I offered a polite nod to the stunned crowd, turned around and walked out of the ballroom, leaving them to choke on their own destruction. I left the suffocating atmosphere of the grand ballroom and stepped out into the cool Atlanta night air. The valet brought my town car around immediately. I slid into the quiet sanctuary of the leatherback seat and instructed my driver to take the long route back to the Waldorf Astoria. My phone buzzed shortly after we merged onto the highway. It was an encrypted audio link from Evelyn. Before I had been unceremoniously locked out of my own Buckhead estate, I had personally overseen the installation of a military-grade smart home security system. Kendrick had been so eager to change the gate codes and the front door locks that he completely neglected to wipe the internal network administration protocols. Sitting in the quiet darkness of my car, I tapped the screen and connected to the live audio feed from the primary living room of my former home. I listened as the monster I had raised turned on his puppet master. Kendrick burst through the heavy mahogany front doors, his breathing ragged and heavy, echoing loudly through the hidden microphones. I had slipped him from his tuxedo pocket. I had slipped him from his tuxedo pocket and slammed it violently onto the marble foyer table. "What the hell is this, Meredith?" he screamed, his voice cracking under the immense pressure of his own catastrophic stupidity. "My father just shoved this into my pocket in front of half the city. It shows a direct transfer protocol. It shows you setting up a shadow account in Zurich. He knows about the $20 million I borrowed from the Petrov syndicate, and he knows you are planning to drain the remaining operational capital and leave me holding the bag." The internal conflict I had carefully engineered was detonating exactly on schedule. Kendrick was pacing like a cornered animal, realizing for the first time that the walls were closing in around him. He demanded answers. He demanded to know why the woman he betrayed his own flesh and blood for was secretly packing a financial parachute to abandon him. Listening over the audio feed, I waited for a brief moment of dead silence. A lesser woman would have crumbled under the weight of such undeniable proof. She would have stuttered or confessed. But Meredith was a predator trained by a desperate, bankrupt family to survive at any cost. She did not confess. She pivoted with terrifying speed. The sharp, sudden sound of a heavy slap echoed through the microphone, followed immediately by the sound of Meredith bursting into violent theatrical tears. "How dare you?" "Kendrick," she sobbed, her voice vibrating with weaponized victimhood. "How can you possibly believe the lies of a senile, bitter old man over your own wife?" She began a masterful display of psychological manipulation. She told him that I was a vindictive sociopath trying to destroy their beautiful marriage because I was intensely jealous of their youthful success. She insisted that the financial document was a complete fabrication, a fake bank statement printed out by Evelyn Pierce to sow division between them. "Do you really think I would ever abandon you?" she cried, her voice breaking with perfect artificial emotion. "We are building an empire together. Your father is losing his mind. He is so desperate to cling to his lost power that he hired hackers to create fake routing numbers just to drive you insane. He wants you to doubt me so that you will run back to him begging for forgiveness. Are you really going to let that arrogant old truck driver ruin what we have built?" She wrapped her arms around him, burying her face in his chest, sobbing loudly into his tailored suit. She twisted the narrative with such flawless execution that it was almost impressive to witness. She painted me as the ultimate villain, a jealous monster forging federal banking documents just to break his son's heart. She knew exactly which buttons to push to activate Kendrick's deep-seated insecurities. She stroked his ego, reminding him that he was the true visionary, the real CEO who was going to save Titan Freight from my outdated methods. I waited for my son to show a single shred of deductive reasoning. I waited for him to demand the login credentials to her accounts or to call her bluff with basic logic. Instead, I heard his breathing steady. I heard him wrap his arms around the woman who was actively planning his absolute demise. "I am sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with pathetic submission. "I am so stressed, Meredith. The pressure from the board, the merger, the loan sharks, it is all getting to my head. My son was an absolute fool. He willingly swallowed her toxic lies because the alternative, realizing his wife was a parasite and his father was right, was entirely too painful for his fragile ego to bear." Meredith kissed him, wiping her fake tears away, and immediately went back on the offensive. "We need to eliminate him completely, Kendrick," she whispered coldly. "He is a dangerous liability. We need to strip him of his last remaining asset." Kendrick agreed blindly. He decided right then and there to squeeze the final drop of value out of my legacy. He needed total control over the Titan Freight software to finalize the merger and appease the violent loan sharks breathing down his neck. He resolved to play me one last time, genuinely believing he was the smartest man in the room. Less than an hour later, my private cell phone vibrated on the seat next to me. The caller ID flashed Kendrick's name. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my finger across the screen to answer. I did not say a word. I just listened to the dead air. Dad Kendrick said, his tone completely stripped of the hostility he had displayed at the gala. It was replaced by a sickeningly smooth, overly affectionate cadence. "Listen, we got off on the wrong foot tonight. Emotions are running high. I want to make things right between us." I remained completely silent, letting his desperation fill the void. "I know you are upset about the $50 million in the retirement fund," he continued, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "That was a drastic measure to secure the merger, but I want to give it back to you. I will wire the entire $50 million back into your personal accounts by tomorrow morning with an additional $10 million as a peace offering. All I need from you in return is one simple signature." We need to formally finalize the perpetual transfer of your original logistics source code to the Titan Freight corporate umbrella. Just sign the permanent intellectual property transfer and you can walk away a very rich man to enjoy your retirement in peace. He was trying to buy the very engine of my empire with my own stolen money. It was an insult wrapped in an extortion attempt. He thought he could dangle my own funds in front of my face and trick me into giving up the master key. I smiled, staring out the window at the dark city streets. "That sounds like a very generous proposition, son," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly measured and agreeable. "We should discuss the terms in person. Meet me tomorrow at noon at the Capital City Club. Come alone. We will settle this family business once and for all." I hung up the phone and locked the screen. The blood negotiation was officially set. Kendrick thought he was walking into a simple business transaction. He had no idea he was walking straight into an execution. I arrived at the Capital City Club precisely at noon. The private dining room I had reserved was located at the very back of the establishment, shielded by heavy velvet curtains and thick soundproof oak doors. Kendrick was already sitting at the polished mahogany table. He looked entirely exhausted. The tailored suit he wore could not hide the dark circles under his eyes or the nervous, frantic tapping of his expensive leather shoes against the floorboards. He was trying to project the aura of a victorious chief executive, but he just looked like a desperate man rapidly running out of time. I sat down directly across from him, smoothing the lapels of my suit. There was no food on the table and no waiters in the room. This was not a social lunch. Kendrick reached into his designer briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He slid them across the table, stopping right in front of me. He placed an expensive gold fountain pen on top of the crisp white paper. "There it is, Dad," he said, trying to keep his voice steady and authoritative. "The permanent intellectual property transfer agreement. As soon as your signature is on that dotted line, I will personally wire $60 million into any offshore account you choose. You get your stolen retirement back with a massive bonus, and Titan Freight gets full permanent ownership of the logistical source code. It is a completely clean break. You can walk away from this corporate stress and spend the rest of your life relaxing on a beach somewhere without a single worry." Kendrick leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms in a display of forced confidence. "Just sign the contract and we can put all this ugly family drama behind us forever." I did not even look at the contract. I did not reach for the gold pin. I kept my cold gaze locked entirely on my son's face, watching the fragile illusion of power he was trying so desperately to maintain. "You are offering to buy the engine of my life with money you stole from my own vault," I said, my voice incredibly low and devoid of any warmth. "That is not a business negotiation, Kendrick. That is the pathetic thrashing of a man who knows he is drowning and has no idea how to swim." I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I tossed it onto the center of the table. The flap opened and a dozen high-resolution 8x10 photographs spilled out across the polished wood, completely covering his fraudulent contract. Kendrick uncrossed his arms and leaned forward. His eyes darted to the glossy images and his entire body instantly froze. The photographs were undeniably clear. They were taken by my private investigator just 2 days ago. They showed Meredith in the dimly lit corner of a luxury hotel lounge, wrapped in a deeply passionate embrace with another man. The subsequent photos showed them entering a private elevator together and later sharing a very intimate moment on a secluded balcony. "The man kissing your wife is Arthur Vance," I stated brutally, outlining the reality he was staring at. "He is the senior corporate attorney for Montgomery Global. He is the exact same lawyer who drafted the fake power of attorney you used to lock me out of my own home. He is also the man currently helping Meredith structure the offshore shell accounts in Zurich to hide the money she is stealing from you." I watched Kendrick's chest heave as he stared at the images. "While you are busy taking out $20 million loans from violent Russian syndicates and trying to steal my legacy, your wife is sleeping with her father's lawyer. They are laughing at you, Kendrick. They are using your signature to assume all the legal risk while they prepare to leave you completely bankrupt and facing federal prison. Look at the pictures, son. Look at the woman you betrayed your own blood to protect." For a long, painful moment, I thought the reality of the situation would finally break through his monumental arrogance. I watched his hands shake violently as he picked up one of the photographs. His face turned an ashen shade of gray, and I could hear his shallow, rapid breathing. The absolute ultimate humiliation was sitting right in his hands. His pride, the fragile ego that drove him to destroy our family, was completely shattered. But a deeply foolish man will always choose a comfortable lie over a devastating truth. He was protecting his ego from the sheer trauma of being a cuckold and a disposable pawn. Instead of accepting reality and begging for my help to dismantle the Montgomery family, Kendrick's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He slammed the photograph down onto the table and pointed a trembling finger at my chest. "This is a complete fabrication," he hissed, his voice shaking with absolute denial. "These are fake. You hired someone to digitally alter these images just to manipulate me. You cannot stand the fact that I am running Titan Freight better than you ever did. You are so intensely jealous of my success and my marriage that you would stoop to creating fake evidence just to destroy my confidence. You are a sick, bitter old man." Kendrick stood up violently, his chair crashing backward onto the thick carpet. He planted both his fists on the table, leaning over the scattered photos of his cheating wife and glaring at me with eyes full of manic hatred. "You think you can play these psychological games with me?" he shouted, completely abandoning any pretense of a civilized negotiation. "You think you hold all the cards because of some outdated software license? You are wrong, Garrison. I am the acting chief executive officer of this company, and I control the physical assets, all of them." He took a deep breath, his face twisting into a sneer of pure malice. He was about to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. "Do you remember the Willow Creek estate?" he asked, his voice dropping to a vicious threat. "The 50 acres of pristine private land in North Georgia, where Mom is buried. The estate you transferred into the corporate holding trust for tax purposes a decade ago." My blood instantly ran cold. Yvonne rested in a beautiful marble mausoleum at the center of that property, surrounded by the weeping willows she loved so much. "I control that holding trust. Now," Kendrick continued, savoring the cruelty of his words, "if you do not sign over the intellectual property rights to the Titan software by tomorrow morning, I am going to liquidate that entire estate. I have a buyer ready. It is a commercial industrial developer. They want to level the entire 50 acres and build a highly toxic waste processing facility right on top of it. I will have the excavators tear down that marble monument and dig up her casket before the weekend is over. I will let them pave over her memory with concrete and garbage if you do not give me exactly what I want." He picked up his briefcase and walked toward the door, leaving the contract and the gold pen on the table. "You have 24 hours, old man," he spat before slamming the door behind him. I sat alone in the silent room, staring at the heavy oak door, realizing my son had just signed his own death warrant. I was still sitting in the private dining room of the Capital City Club, staring at the heavy oak door my son had just slammed shut, when my phone vibrated against the mahogany table. It was Evelyn. Her voice was sharp and entirely devoid of any pleasantries. "Garrison, you need to turn on the local news right now," she commanded. "Meredith just beat us to the courthouse. While Kendrick was distracting you with that pathetic extortion attempt, his wife was filing an emergency petition in probate court. She submitted a newly discovered handwritten will supposedly written by Yvonne just months before she passed away. I felt a cold, heavy knot form in my stomach. Yvonne and I had drafted our wills together decades ago with an ironclad mutual trust. "What does this fabricated document say?" I asked, keeping my breathing perfectly steady despite the rising fury in my chest. Evelyn sighed heavily. "It claims that Yvonne secretly revoked her original will because she feared for her physical safety. It transfers her entire 50% stake of the family holding trust directly to Kendrick. That includes the Willow Creek estate where she is buried. Meredith is using this document to grant Kendrick absolute legal authority to liquidate the cemetery property immediately. They timed this perfectly, Garrison. They knew Kendrick could not bully you into signing over the software, so Meredith manufactured a legal loophole to hold your wife's resting place hostage and force your hand. By the time I returned to the Waldorf Astoria, the coordinated smear campaign was fully operational. Montgomery Global had weaponized their expensive public relations firm. Every major news network in Atlanta was running breaking segments on the corporate titan who secretly terrorized his own family. The headlines flashing across the television screen were designed to completely destroy my reputation and isolate me from any potential allies. They painted me as a ruthless domestic abuser, claiming Yvonne lived her final years in absolute silent terror. Meredith gave a tearful, highly scripted televised interview on the courthouse steps, clutching a white handkerchief and claiming she was simply fulfilling her late mother-in-law's desperate final wishes. She looked directly into the news cameras and stated that I was a violent tyrant who controlled my wife through intimidation and fear. They wanted to ruin me in the court of public opinion so no judge would dare rule in my favor when I challenged the document. They thought the overwhelming public shame would force me into hiding. They were completely wrong. I did not waste a single second watching Meredith cry fake tears for the cameras. I looked at Evelyn, who had already utilized her court contacts to secure a high-resolution certified scan of the physical document. The handwriting was an incredibly sophisticated forgery. It captured the exact slant, the pressure, and the unique curve of Yvonne's signature. A standard probate judge would absolutely accept it at face value without a second thought. "We are not fighting this battle in the press," I told Evelyn, my voice a lethal whisper. "We are going to completely dismantle this lie in a forensic laboratory." Evelyn made a single encrypted phone call to a highly classified contact. An hour later, we walked into the private subterranean laboratory of a former federal document examiner. He was a man who spent 30 years authenticating historical artifacts and exposing international financial fraud for the government. He placed the high-resolution physical scan of the forged will under a massive spectral imaging microscope. We stood in the dim light of the lab watching the high-definition monitor as he magnified the ink strokes to a microscopic level. Kendrick and Meredith paid an absolute fortune for this forgery. The penmanship was visually flawless, but criminals who rely on stolen money always overlook the fundamental science of their crimes. The forensic examiner adjusted the heavy brass dials on his spectrometer and highlighted a specific chemical signature on the glowing screen. "The ink used to write this document is a highly specialized gel compound," he explained, pointing to a rising blue graph on his monitor. "It contains a proprietary synthetic dye marker developed by a specific Japanese manufacturer to prevent corporate check fraud." He turned around in his chair and looked me directly in the eye. "Mr. Cole, your wife passed away exactly 3 years ago." I nodded, confirming the timeline while keeping my posture completely rigid. The examiner tapped the thick glass of the monitor with a metal pen. The specific synthetic dye marker found in the ink of this handwritten will did not hit the commercial market until 14 months ago. He crossed his arms, delivering the final devastating verdict. "It is chemically impossible for your late wife to have written this document. The ink did not even exist on this planet when she was alive. It is an absolute, undeniable forgery." A profound sense of cold, calculated satisfaction washed over me. Kendrick and Meredith had paid an underground forger to copy Yvonne's handwriting perfectly, but they were stupid enough to use a modern pen to execute the crime. They handed me the exact rope I needed to hang them in federal court. Presenting a forged document to a probate judge to steal real estate was a massive felony carrying years of prison time. Evelyn quickly packed the printed chemical analysis, the spectral graphs, and the expert sworn affidavit into her heavy leather briefcase. "We have them. Garrison," she said, her eyes blazing with absolute legal triumph. "This report instantly nullifies their claim to the Willow Creek estate and exposes Meredith to severe criminal perjury charges. I am taking this directly to the federal courthouse right now to file an emergency injunction." I stayed behind at the laboratory to coordinate our next aggressive move with the federal authorities. I needed to ensure the white-collar division of the FBI was fully briefed the exact second Evelyn filed the forensic affidavit with the court clerk. Evelyn walked out to her car, clutching the leather briefcase against her chest like an impenetrable shield. She was going to deliver the fatal legal blow to Montgomery Global and save Yvonne's resting place. I watched her drive away, feeling a rare moment of absolute victory. 10 minutes later, my encrypted phone rang loudly in the quiet lab. It was not Evelyn calling to confirm the filing. It was an automated emergency alert from the Atlanta Police Department traffic routing system, a digital connection I secretly maintained from my early days building the city's logistical grid. A catastrophic traffic collision had just occurred at the major downtown intersection exactly 2 blocks from the federal courthouse steps. I instantly pulled up the live traffic camera feed on my tablet. My blood froze completely solid in my veins. The intersection was a horrific scene of absolute metallic carnage. Evelyn's dark blue sedan was pinned violently against a concrete median barrier, completely crushed on the driver's side. A massive unmarked commercial delivery truck had blown through a solid red light at high speed and T-boned her vehicle with lethal precision. The impact was entirely devastating. I zoomed in on the grainy camera feed, my heart pounding against my ribs. The truck driver was nowhere to be seen, having clearly fled the scene on foot into the crowded, panicked city streets. Bright orange flames were already erupting from the shattered engine block of Evelyn's car, thick black smoke billowing high into the Atlanta sky. Emergency sirens wailed sharply in the background of the live audio feed. Through the shattered spiderweb glass of the windshield, I could see the blazing fire spreading rapidly directly into the passenger cabin. The flames were quickly consuming the leather briefcase that held our undeniable forensic proof. The only piece of physical evidence that could save my late wife's resting place and send Meredith to federal prison was currently burning to ash inside a crushed, burning vehicle. They had not just stolen my company and my money. Kendrick and Meredith had just escalated this corporate war to calculated attempted murder. I did not wait for the local news to confirm what I already saw on the traffic feed. I immediately dialed the emergency surgical wing at Grady Memorial Hospital, utilizing a private contact I had on the administrative board. The head trauma surgeon answered on the fourth ring. He informed me that emergency responders had pulled Evelyn from the burning wreckage just seconds before the gas tank completely detonated. She was alive, but barely. She had suffered severe fractured ribs, a collapsed lung, and significant head trauma. She was currently being rushed into emergency surgery, and her exact prognosis was entirely uncertain. I ended the call and stood perfectly still in the sterile quiet of the forensic laboratory. The faint hum of the spectral imaging equipment was the only sound in the room. For the past week, I had operated under the assumption that this was a high-stakes financial dispute. I was playing a game of chess, treating Kendrick and Meredith as greedy corporate adversaries who could be dismantled through superior legal strategy and asset manipulation. That assumption was a fatal miscalculation. They had just tried to incinerate my closest ally on a public street to steal a piece of land. They had crossed the absolute permanent line from white-collar fraud to cold-blooded attempted murder. The corporate chessboard was officially destroyed. There was no more playing defense. There was no more waiting for them to make a legal mistake. I thanked the forensic examiner, packed up my remaining digital files, and walked out into the humid Atlanta afternoon. I was no longer an ousted executive trying to reclaim his stolen company. I was a man going to war. I headed straight back to the Waldorf Astoria to initiate the complete and total destruction of Montgomery Global. As soon as I secured the heavy door of my penthouse suite, I booted up my secondary encrypted laptop. I bypassed the standard commercial servers and routed my connection through an untraceable virtual private network located offshore. I opened a highly secure video conferencing portal and sent a single priority access link to the personal devices of the 18 industry executives who had walked out of the Titan Freight boardroom with me. These were the men and women who controlled the vast majority of the supply chain infrastructure in North America. Within precisely 4 minutes, all 18 of them logged into the secure channel. Their faces filled my screen, looking serious and attentive. They knew I would not contact them on a burner channel unless the situation was highly critical. Gentlemen and ladies, I began, my voice cutting through the digital static with absolute command. You walked out of that boardroom because you trusted my leadership over the hollow promises of my son. Today, I am asking you to convert that trust into the most lucrative offensive strike in the history of this industry. I explained the exact details of the Titan Freight intellectual property structure. I revealed that I personally owned the core logistical software and that the poison pill I activated would completely shut down the Titan network in less than 48 hours. Their screens would go dark, their shipping routes would fail, and Montgomery Global would be left holding an empty, burning shell. I am not just destroying their company. I continued, locking eyes with the camera lens. I am creating a massive, instantaneous vacuum in the global market, and I am offering you the exclusive right to fill it. I propose the formation of an entirely new logistical syndicate. I would grant them immediate exclusive access to my proprietary software. We would seamlessly absorb Titan Freight's abandoned client base overnight. They would gain absolute market dominance, and in exchange, they would completely blacklist Montgomery Global and Titan Freight from every port, warehouse, and shipping lane on the continent. The executives did not need to deliberate. They understood the brutal math of the offer. They were watching a wounded Titan bleed out, and I was handing them the buckets. One by one, the executives nodded their agreement. The silent pact was sealed. Titan Freight was officially marked for death. I closed the encrypted video application, feeling the immense weight of the newly formed syndicate solidifying my position. I reached for my glass of bourbon to take a single calculated sip when the heavy mahogany door of my penthouse suite suddenly exploded inward. The violent crash sent wood splinters flying across the marble foyer. 3 massive men stepped through the shattered doorframe. They did not look like corporate security or local police. They wore dark tactical jackets and carried the distinct, terrifying aura of men who made their living inflicting severe physical trauma. The lead intruder stepped into the living room, his cold, dead eyes locking onto me. He was a high-ranking enforcer for the Petrov Syndicate, the exact same black market organization Kendrick had foolishly borrowed $20 million from. "Your arrogant son made a very bad investment, old man." The enforcer growled, his thick Russian accent slicing through the quiet room. He pledged his shares of Titan Freight as collateral for a $20 million loan. But word on the street is that Titan Freight is about to be completely worthless. That means his debt falls directly onto his family. He pulled a heavy suppressed pistol from his jacket and aimed it squarely at my chest. "Kendrick cannot pay us, so we are going to extract the debt directly from you." I did not raise my hands. I did not stand up or beg for my life. I remained perfectly seated at the glass dining table, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my bourbon. The enforcer narrowed his eyes, clearly unsettled by my complete lack of panic. "You are pointing a gun at the wrong target," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and entirely undisturbed. "My son is a fool who signed his own death warrant, but he does not actually have the money you are looking for. The $20 million he borrowed from your syndicate was immediately funneled into a Cayman Islands shell company controlled by Richard Montgomery. They used your capital to artificially inflate Montgomery Global and left Kendrick holding the empty bag." The enforcer kept his weapon raised, but his posture shifted slightly. "We do not care about corporate politics," he snapped. "We only care about the money, and I am about to show you exactly where your money went," I replied, placing my glass down. I turned my attention back to my encrypted laptop. While Evelyn and I were tracking my stolen retirement funds, we uncovered the entire offshore financial architecture of Montgomery Global. Richard Montgomery was not just a terrible businessman. He was actively running a massive international money laundering operation to hide his catastrophic losses. He had been illegally washing funds through his real estate acquisitions for the past 7 years. I had compiled every single fraudulent wire transfer, every illegal shell company routing number, and every hidden ledger into one massive digital dossier. I looked at the enforcer, the barrel of his suppressed pistol still aimed at my heart. I rested my index finger over the enter key on my keyboard. "Montgomery Global stole your $20 million, I stated firmly. "And I am about to freeze every single asset they possess globally." I pressed the key. With one single keystroke, the entire encrypted dossier of Richard Montgomery's money laundering empire was transmitted directly to the primary secure server of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The digital bomb was officially dropped. The enforcer lowered his suppressed weapon slowly. He looked at the confirmation screen on my laptop and understood the brutal efficiency of my move. He gave a single curt nod, sliding his pistol back into his dark jacket, and walked out of my penthouse with his men leaving me alone in the shattered foyer. The wheels of federal justice turn notoriously slow until you hand them a perfectly organized roadmap to billions of dollars in international money laundering. Less than 4 hours after I hit the send button, the Federal Bureau of Investigation mobilized a massive tactical unit. It was just past 2 in the morning when a fleet of black armored vehicles descended upon the towering glass headquarters of Montgomery Global in downtown Atlanta. Heavily armed federal agents poured into the pristine lobby, completely overwhelming the bewildered night security staff. They secured every entrance and exit, locking down the entire 30-story skyscraper in a matter of minutes. Teams of cyber forensic specialists raided the executive suites, ripping hard drives from the servers and seizing every physical ledger they could find in the hidden wall safes. The glowing Montgomery logo at the top of the building suddenly looked like a giant neon target. The federal agents were not just looking for a few missing millions. They were systematically dismantling an international criminal enterprise layer by layer. I watched the live helicopter footage broadcasted on the local news channels from the comfort of my hotel room. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the street below, casting long shadows across the concrete. The untouchable empire built on stolen money and endless arrogance was being torn apart before the sun even had a chance to rise. At exactly 3 in the morning, Richard Montgomery was escorted out of his own corporate fortress. He was no longer the arrogant, untouchable titan of Atlanta high society. He looked incredibly small, frail, and entirely defeated. Federal agents flanked him, guiding him toward a waiting black transport vehicle. His wrists were secured tightly in steel handcuffs, catching the glaring light of the frantic press cameras waiting on the sidewalk. The man who had sneered at my working-class roots and tried to steal my legacy was now being shoved into the back of a federal van like a common street criminal. By the time the stock market opened at 9 in the morning, the news of the massive federal raid and the money laundering charges had completely saturated the financial wire. The market reaction was instantaneous and violently merciless. Montgomery Global stock plummeted into an absolute freefall. Institutional investors panicked, dumping their shares by the millions. The valuation of the company evaporated by 80% within the first hour of trading. Over at the Titan Freight headquarters, the atmosphere was pure, unadulterated chaos. Meredith burst into the executive suite, her carefully maintained facade completely shattered. Her hair was disheveled and her eyes were wide with sheer manic panic. She slammed the heavy door behind her, cornering Kendrick behind the massive mahogany desk that used to be mine. She screamed at him, demanding that he fix the monumental disaster immediately. Her father was sitting in a federal holding cell facing a bail set at astronomical heights, and her family trust was entirely frozen. She slammed her hands onto the desk and ordered Kendrick to immediately liquidate the Titan Freight Emergency Corporate Reserve Fund. It was a highly restricted vault holding exactly $100 million of liquid capital designed to keep the national fleet operational during severe economic crashes. Meredith did not care about the shipping fleet or the thousands of employees. She demanded Kendrick wire the entire $100 million to her private offshore account to bail out her father and secure her own escape route before the federal agents came for her next. She screamed that he owed her family, that he was nothing without her bloodline, and that if he did not wire the money immediately, she would personally throw him to the Russian syndicate waiting outside. Kendrick, completely terrified of his wife and paralyzed by the mounting disaster, completely caved to her demands. Kendrick frantically turned to his executive terminal. His hands shook violently as he logged into the primary banking portal for Titan Freight. He navigated to the restricted corporate reserve interface, his fingers slipping on the keyboard in his haste. He typed in his newly minted chief executive officer credentials and initiated the massive wire transfer for $100 million. He hit the execute button, expecting the funds to instantly vanish into Meredith's waiting accounts to save his crumbling marriage. Instead, a harsh red warning box filled the center of his high-definition monitor. Access denied. He gasped, hitting the backspace key and retyping his complex multi-character password. He authorized the transfer a second time, gripping the edge of the desk. The system flashed red again. Critical security override active. Master encryption key required. Kendrick stared at the screen, his breathing shallow and rapid. When he and Meredith had locked me out of the building and wiped my local administrative access, they arrogantly assumed they had severed all my ties to the company treasury. They had no idea that the emergency reserve fund was hardwired directly into the core logistical algorithm to prevent hostile corporate raiding. The exact same proprietary algorithm I had legally revoked just 24 hours ago at the Federal Copyright Office. The entire financial architecture of the company was permanently tethered to my personal biometric signature. Kendrick had the fancy title and the massive corner office, but he was completely locked out of the vault. The invisible handcuffs had snapped shut around his wrists. The $100 million sat safely behind an impenetrable digital wall, and I was the only man on earth holding the key. The crushing realization finally broke my son. He was trapped in a highly toxic marriage, chained to a rapidly sinking corporate anchor and actively hunted by violent loan sharks who wanted their $20 million back today. He had absolutely nowhere left to run. My secure phone rang, slicing through the quiet tension of my penthouse suite. I answered the call but remained completely silent, letting the dead air stretch between us. Dad Kendrick's voice came through the speaker, sounding completely unrecognizable. It was not the voice of a confident executive or a ruthless corporate raider. It was the pathetic whimpering of a broken, terrified little boy. He was crying openly, his breath hitching between violent, uncontrolled sobs. "Please, Dad, please, you have to help me. The system will not let me access the reserves. Meredith is losing her mind and destroying the office. The Petrov Syndicate just called my personal cell. They are sitting in the lobby of the headquarters, Dad. They said if I do not come downstairs with their money in 10 minutes, they are going to come up here and kill me. You have to unlock the treasury. Just this one time. I am begging you on my hands and knees, Dad. I will give you everything back. I will sign anything you want. Just please save my life." I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the sprawling city of Atlanta, the city I built my empire in, the city where I laid my wife to rest, the city where my son betrayed me for a taste of cheap, unearned validation. I listened to his desperate, pathetic tears. He was not apologizing for trying to lock me in a psychiatric ward. He was not apologizing for the fiery car crash that nearly killed Evelyn. He was only apologizing because he had finally run out of other people's money and the consequences had finally arrived at his door. "You made your bed, Kendrick," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth, any anger, or any fatherly affection. It was a voice carved from solid ice. "Now you have to lie in it." I tapped the red button on my screen and disconnected the call permanently. I set the phone down on the table, walked over to the bar, and poured myself a fresh glass of bourbon. With the phone disconnected and the vault permanently locked, Kendrick faced the violent reality of the Petrov syndicate waiting in his lobby. He had precisely 10 minutes to produce $20 million or forfeit his life. In a state of absolute panicked delusion, my son committed the ultimate act of corporate suicide. He sprinted to the hidden wall safe in the executive office and pulled out his physical stock certificates. These were the original bearer shares that represented his entire personal controlling stake in Titan Freight. The shares I had gifted him years ago when I foolishly believed he could carry on my legacy. Kendrick rushed down to the lobby, clutching the heavy parchment paper like a shield. He bypassed the terrified security guards and approached the lead Russian enforcer. Sweating profusely and shaking uncontrollably, Kendrick slammed the bearer shares onto the reception desk. He blindly signed a transfer of ownership document, practically begging the syndicate to take his entire portion of the company in exchange for immediate debt forgiveness and a small injection of physical cash to appease his wife. He handed over a company valued at billions to an international crime syndicate for a fraction of its worth. He genuinely believed he was buying himself time. He thought he could restructure the company later or somehow manipulate the market to recover his losses. He did not realize that by signing those shares over to a known criminal enterprise, he had permanently nullified his own executive authority and triggered a massive federal review of the corporate charter. He walked back to the elevator clutching a briefcase of dirty cash, thinking he had saved his marriage and his life. He had just sold his soul to the devil for pennies. While Kendrick was busy handing his entire future over to the Russian mob, Meredith was executing her own final exit strategy. She had absolutely no intention of sinking with the Montgomery Global ship or staying married to a man who had just painted a massive target on his own back. She returned to my former Buckhead estate, moving with the frantic speed of a rat fleeing a burning building. Waiting for her in the grand foyer was Arthur Vance, the senior corporate attorney for her father's ruined company and her secret lover. Arthur had brought a stack of expedited unilateral divorce papers. Meredith did not even bother to read the legal clauses. She grabbed a pen and viciously signed her name, completely severing her legal ties to Kendrick. She was leaving him to face the federal agents, the loan sharks, and the total collapse of his life entirely alone. She marched upstairs to the master suite and pulled a sleek titanium suitcase from the closet. She systematically emptied the hidden wall safe, loading the suitcase with millions of dollars in uncut diamonds, luxury watches, and heavy gold bullion that she had siphoned from the family trust over the past year. She zipped the suitcase shut with a cold, satisfied smile. Arthur stood by the door, nervously checking his watch as she pulled up the encrypted banking application on her phone. She stared lovingly at the digital screen, verifying that the $50 million she had stolen from my offshore retirement fund was resting safely in the Cayman Islands shell company. "We have the cash and we have the assets," she told Arthur, her voice completely devoid of any guilt or human empathy. "Kendrick is currently downstairs dealing with the cartel. By the time he realizes I filed for divorce and emptied the house, we will be touching down in a non-extradition jurisdiction. Let the feds have my father and let the Russians have my pathetic husband. We are taking the money and disappearing." They loaded the heavy titanium suitcase into the trunk of Arthur's sleek black sports car and sped away from the estate. They were driving straight toward a private airstrip on the outskirts of Atlanta, completely convinced they had pulled off the perfect crime. They believed they were untouchable, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake without suffering a single consequence. The private aviation terminal was eerily silent under the dark Atlanta sky. A sleek, chartered Gulfstream jet sat idling on the secluded tarmac, its twin engines emitting a low, powerful whine that signaled an immediate departure. Arthur parked the sports car directly next to the boarding stairs. He popped the trunk and hauled the heavy titanium suitcase out while Meredith stepped onto the tarmac, clutching her designer handbag tightly against her chest. She looked up at the luxurious aircraft, practically tasting the freedom and the stolen wealth waiting for her across the ocean. They hurried toward the illuminated steps, the deafening sound of the jet engines masking their footsteps. As Meredith reached for the metal handrail, a tall figure stepped out from the deep shadows of the aircraft hangar. I walked slowly and deliberately into the bright pool of halogen light illuminating the tarmac, planting myself directly between Meredith and the boarding stairs. I wore a dark tailored overcoat, my hands resting calmly in my pockets. The sudden sight of me caused Meredith to physically recoil. She gasped, stumbling backward and nearly tripping over her expensive heels. Arthur dropped the heavy suitcase onto the concrete with a loud metallic thud, his eyes darting around the empty runway in sheer panic. "Move out of my way!" "Garrison," Meredith hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of terror and lingering arrogance. "You cannot stop me. I have a legally chartered flight, and if you try to hold me here, I will scream for the airport security. You have absolutely no power over me anymore. My father might be in a holding cell, but I am leaving this miserable city tonight and taking your entire fortune with me." I did not move a single inch. I looked at the frightened, desperate woman standing before me and felt absolutely nothing but cold, supreme clarity. "You are not going anywhere, Meredith," I stated, my voice cutting cleanly through the roar of the jet engines. "Airport security is not going to help you. The pilots sitting in that cockpit are not going to fly you. I chartered this particular jet 3 hours ago under a corporate alias specifically to ensure you had a designated place to arrive." I slowly pulled my right hand from my overcoat pocket. I was holding a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy red federal seal. I tossed the papers onto the concrete directly at her feet. "That is a global asset freezing injunction issued directly by the United States Department of the Treasury," I explained, watching her eyes widen in absolute horror. "The $50 million you thought was resting safely in the Cayman Islands is completely locked. I used my original biometric authentication and a federal fraud mandate to permanently freeze the Apex Horizon Shell Company. The international authorities have seized the routing numbers. You cannot transfer a single cent. You cannot withdraw a single dollar. The account is effectively dead." Meredith stared at the documents on the ground, her face turning ghostly pale. She scrambled to pull her phone from her handbag, her fingers shaking violently as she opened her encrypted banking application. The screen that previously displayed $50 million now flashed a harsh red warning code indicating a total federal freeze. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking into a high-pitched wail. "No, this is my money. I earned this." She spun around to Arthur, pointing desperately at the titanium suitcase on the tarmac. "Grab the diamonds, Arthur. Grab the bags and let us run. We can still get out of here." Arthur took one look at me and then looked at the sleek black SUVs that were suddenly rolling out of the darkness surrounding the runway. Federal agents stepped out of the vehicles, their badges gleaming in the harsh tarmac lights. Arthur slowly raised his hands, backing away from Meredith and the suitcase. He was abandoning her just as quickly as she had abandoned Kendrick. Meredith stood completely alone on the cold concrete. Her father was in prison. Her husband was sold to the mob. Her lover had surrendered. The stolen billions were gone. She clutched her empty handbag, screaming into the night air, having been stripped of absolutely everything. Meredith watched in sheer terror as federal agents confiscated the titanium suitcase and placed her lover Arthur Vance in heavy steel handcuffs. By a narrow stroke of legal bureaucracy, the agents on the tarmac were executing a financial injunction and a targeted arrest warrant for the corporate attorney. They did not have an immediate physical mandate to detain Meredith at that exact second. Left standing alone on the cold concrete runway, stripped of her stolen millions and her escape route, her survival instincts kicked into overdrive. She realized she had only one desperate play left on the board. She had to return to the husband she had just tried to abandon and bleed him for whatever was left. Meredith scrambled back to the Buckhead estate, arriving just as Kendrick walked through the front door, battered and bruised from his terrifying encounter with the Russian syndicate. He was clutching a small briefcase of dirty cash, looking like a hollow, haunted man. Meredith instantly morphed back into the devoted, loyal wife. She smoothly ignored the unilateral divorce papers sitting on the foyer table, sliding them out of sight. She threw her arms around Kendrick, weeping synthetic theatrical tears. She told him a masterful lie, claiming Arthur had tried to abduct her and steal their assets, but she had bravely fought him off to return to her true love. Kendrick, shattered by fear and desperate for any shred of loyalty, swallowed her toxic deception without a single question. "We can still fix this, Kendrick," she whispered, stroking his tear-stained cheek with her manicured fingers. "We still have the public merger ceremony tomorrow morning. Once you sign the final documents integrating Montgomery Global with Titan Freight, the massive corporate valuation will stabilize everything. We will have enough institutional leverage to pay off the Russians and save my father from federal prison. You will be the undisputed king of the entire industry." Kendrick, blinded by his own fragile ego and sheer exhaustion, agreed to proceed with the grand spectacle. The official signing ceremony was hosted the very next morning in the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel. Kendrick and Meredith had spared absolutely no expense attempting to project an illusion of unstoppable corporate strength to the public. Crystal chandeliers sparkled brilliantly above towering floral arrangements. An army of waitstaff served premium caviar and champagne to a room packed tightly with media personnel, investment bankers, and industry vultures. They were throwing a multi-million-dollar party on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship. Kendrick stood on a raised stage behind a massive velvet-draped table, practically vibrating with nervous energy. He was flanked by the remaining board members who had betrayed me, all eagerly waiting for the ink to dry on the merger documents. Meredith stood right beside him, wearing a pristine white designer suit projecting the completely false image of a fearless corporate matriarch. The crowd murmured in heavy anticipation as the final legal binders were brought to the table. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom swung wide open with a resounding crash. The ambient chatter of the crowd instantly died, falling into a completely stunned, breathless silence. I walked into the room wearing a sharp-tailored charcoal suit, moving with the slow, deliberate stride of a man who owned the very air he breathed. But I was not walking alone. Flanking me like an impenetrable wall of corporate royalty were the 18 chief executive officers who had walked out of the boardroom days ago. The most powerful men and women in the North American supply chain industry marched right behind me in absolute lockstep. We moved through the center aisle, parting the sea of reporters and bankers like an approaching storm. Kendrick's chest puffed out as he watched me approach the stage. His profound ignorance completely shielded him from the lethal reality of the situation. He looked down at me with a sickeningly smug smile, genuinely believing I had come to witness his ultimate triumph. He thought bringing the 18 executives was my pathetic attempt to surrender publicly and beg for a seat at his newly constructed table. "You finally decided to show up," Dad Kendrick announced, his voice echoing loudly through the microphone for the entire press corps to hear. "It is good of you to come and witness the future. I am glad you brought your friends to see how a real executive handles a multi-billion-dollar expansion." I stopped right at the edge of the stage, looking up at my son with eyes completely devoid of emotion. The 18 executives stood silently behind me, folding their arms in perfect unison. I did not offer Kendrick a single word of congratulations. I did not display a fraction of an ounce of anger. I simply gestured toward the thick, leather-bound merger documents resting on the velvet table. "Do not let me interrupt your historic moment, Kendrick," I said, my voice perfectly calm, carrying effortlessly across the silent ballroom. "Please proceed with the integration." Kendrick sneered, picking up a heavy gold-plated fountain pen. He looked at Meredith, who nodded eagerly, her eyes gleaming with the desperate hope of a massive financial payout to save her own skin. Kendrick leaned over the table, pressing the gold nib against the crisp white paper. He signed his name with a series of aggressive, flourishing strokes, formally authorizing the acquisition. With that single arrogant signature, he legally bound the entire corporate infrastructure of Titan Freight directly to the toxic, rotting carcass of Montgomery Global. He officially assumed all of their astronomical debts, their catastrophic financial liabilities, and their looming federal penalties. He effectively chained himself to a sinking boulder. He held the signed document high in the air for the flashing cameras, sealing his own fate with a triumphant, ignorant grin. The ballroom erupted into a chorus of manufactured applause. Flashbulbs strobed frantically, capturing the exact moment my son sold his soul for absolute ruin. Waiters immediately began circulating through the crowd with silver trays carrying flutes of expensive champagne to commemorate the monumental merger. Kendrick grabbed a glass from a passing tray and stepped to the edge of the stage, raising it high in the air. To the new era of Titan Freight, he shouted, his voice echoing with hollow victory, to unstoppable growth and visionary leadership. Meredith raised her glass beside him, a look of profound relief washing over her face as she finally believed she had successfully secured her golden parachute. A waiter stepped toward me, offering a crystal flute. I took the glass, holding the cold crystal gracefully in my right hand. I looked directly into Kendrick's eyes and offered a slow, chilling smile. I raised my glass to meet his toast. To the new era, I replied, my voice low, but carrying a lethal weight that made the triumphant grin on his face falter for a fraction of a second. I took a slow, deliberate sip. At that exact moment, the 72-hour federal grace period expired. The poison pill I had activated at the Copyright Office reached its absolute 0 hour. Before Kendrick could even bring the champagne to his lips, a deafening, piercing siren violently shattered the celebratory atmosphere. The massive digital presentation screens flanking the stage suddenly flickered violently and went completely black. An instant later, they flashed back to life, glaring with a harsh, blinding red light. A massive system failure warning covered every single monitor in the ballroom. The synchronized emergency alarms from the smartphones of every board member, investor, and media personnel in the room began blaring simultaneously, creating a chaotic symphony of digital panic. The core logistical algorithm of Titan Freight had just forcefully ejected itself from the corporate mainframe. The heartbeat of the empire was gone. The exact millisecond the 72-hour federal grace period expired, the entire North American supply chain experienced a catastrophic digital heart attack. Inside the grand ballroom of the Four Seasons, the massive presentation monitors behind Kendrick morphed from triumphant corporate logos into glaring walls of fatal error codes. But the destruction was not confined to that room. Across the entire country, the proprietary logistical algorithm I had written 3 decades ago completely detached itself from the Titan Freight mainframe. It aggressively purged its own source code from the cloud servers, leaving behind absolutely nothing but empty digital folders. In Seattle, automated distribution centers ground to a violent metallic halt as sorting robots instantly lost their routing commands. In Chicago, thousands of long-haul delivery trucks saw their digital navigation dashboards simultaneously go pitch black, severing their connection to the dispatch grid. The entire $3 billion infrastructure was instantly paralyzed. I stood at the edge of the stage, holding my crystal champagne flute, watching the color drain entirely from my son's face. He dropped his glass. It shattered against the polished stage, but the sound was completely drowned out by the chaotic symphony of blaring cell phone alarms from every investment banker and media reporter in the room. The 18 executives standing behind me remained perfectly still, their expressions forged in cold stone. They knew exactly what they were witnessing. They were watching the absolute unmaking of a corporate giant. Kendrick frantically tapped the screen of his smart tablet, trying desperately to reboot the server protocols. It was a completely futile gesture. He was a man trying to steer a massive cargo ship that had just lost its engine, its rudder, and its navigation system all at the exact same time. The network did not just crash, it was fundamentally erased. The financial algorithms on Wall Street reacted to the catastrophic system failure with terrifying speed. The moment the news of the national logistical blackout hit the financial wires, trading bots initiated a massive, unprecedented sell-off. Within 3 minutes of the poison pill activating, Titan Freight stock plummeted, entering an absolute freefall. The valuation evaporated by a staggering 80%, wiping billions of dollars of theoretical wealth off the ledger in the blink of an eye. The devastating brilliance of my strategy was entirely anchored in the document my son had just proudly signed. By finalizing the merger, Kendrick had legally fused Titan Freight with Montgomery Global. He had intended to use Titan to absorb Montgomery's debts. Instead, he had just chained a multi-billion-dollar hollow shell to an already sinking criminal enterprise. Titan Freight was now functionally worthless, possessing massive operational liabilities and absolutely no software to generate revenue. Because of the signature sitting drying on the velvet table, Montgomery Global was instantly legally responsible for every single cent of that newly acquired debt. Standing just off to the side of the stage was Richard Montgomery. He had managed to post an astronomical federal bail early this morning specifically to attend this ceremony, believing this merger would provide the ultimate financial shield against his pending money laundering charges. As the reporters frantically shouted into their phones and the stock tickers on the ballroom screens bled an aggressive downward red, the sheer magnitude of his absolute ruin finally hit him. He was no longer just facing federal prison. He had just absorbed billions in unpayable corporate debt. Richard clutched his chest, his face turning a sickening shade of gray. He gasped for air that his lungs refused to process. He blindly grabbed the edge of a velvet-draped table, trying to steady himself, but his legs buckled entirely. He pulled the heavy fabric down with him, sending crystal glasses and silver platters crashing to the floor as he collapsed violently. Paramedics were immediately screamed for, but the panic in the room had already reached an uncontrollable fever pitch. He was having a massive cardiovascular event brought on by the sudden realization that his legacy was entirely eradicated. The chaos in the ballroom was about to escalate from a financial disaster to a terrifying physical threat. The heavy oak doors at the rear of the hall that my executives and I had entered through were suddenly violently kicked open. The heavy wood splintered against the wall. A dozen massive men wearing dark tactical jackets poured into the room, shoving past the panicked reporters and screaming socialites. They callously tossed cocktail tables out of their way, marching with lethal intent. It was the Petrov Syndicate. The Russian black market enforcers had just watched the news on their phones. They realized the physical stock certificates Kendrick had desperately handed them in the lobby hours ago to cover his $20 million debt were now completely worthless pieces of paper. They had been scammed, and they had come to collect their pound of flesh in front of the entire city. The lead enforcer, a giant of a man with cold, dead eyes, locked his gaze directly onto Kendrick standing paralyzed on the stage. He shoved a prominent investment banker out of his way and marched purposefully down the center aisle. Kendrick let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. The sheer terror of his impending reality completely shattered whatever fragile masculinity he had left. He abandoned his post at the podium, scrambling backward across the stage. He frantically grabbed the sleeves of Meredith's pristine white designer suit, attempting to hide his trembling body behind his wife. He clutched her arm like a terrified child seeking a human shield against the approaching violence. "Save me, Meredith," he begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic, wet sob. "Tell them we will pay them back. Tell them about your offshore accounts. You have to stop them." Meredith looked down at the pathetic, shivering man cowering behind her. She looked at the approaching Russian mobsters, the crashing stock market figures on the giant screens, and the unconscious body of her father receiving chest compressions on the floor. She realized in one crystallized moment of absolute clarity that her entire grand deception had completely failed. There was no golden parachute, there was no offshore escape fund. She was trapped on a sinking ship, and the man holding onto her ankles was pulling her down faster into the abyss. A look of pure, concentrated venom contorted her features. She violently yanked her arm out of Kendrick's desperate grasp, tearing the expensive fabric of her own jacket in the process. She turned to face him, raising her right hand high into the air. She delivered a vicious, open-handed slap directly across Kendrick's face. The sharp, resounding crack echoed through the microphone on the podium, amplifying his ultimate public humiliation for everyone to hear. "You pathetic, useless fool!" Meredith screamed, her voice tearing through the chaotic ballroom with shrill, absolute hatred. "You ruined everything. You handed away your entire company for nothing. I should have left you to rot the second I realized you were just a weak, ignorant shadow of your father." She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at his face, completely abandoning any pretense of marital loyalty in front of the entire flashing press corps. "You are an absolute failure, Kendrick. You have absolutely nothing left, and I am completely done with you. I hope they tear you apart." Kendrick slumped to his knees, clutching his stinging red cheek, completely broken. Before the Russian enforcers could reach the stage to drag my son away, the sound of heavy tactical boots thundered from the grand hallway. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the massive hotel windows, casting frantic, spinning shadows across the ceiling. Sirens wailed deafeningly from every direction, entirely drowning out the shouts of the crowd. Dozens of heavily armed riot police and federal tactical units swarmed the ballroom with their weapons drawn, sealing every single exit. The doors slammed shut, locking everyone inside. The steel trap I had spent weeks building was finally permanently closed. The heavily armed tactical units formed an impenetrable wall of ballistic shields across the ballroom floor. They aimed their service rifles directly at the Petrov Syndicate enforcers, forcing the massive Russian mobsters to drop their weapons and immediately drop to their knees. The imminent threat of physical violence was temporarily neutralized, But the true terror for my son was just beginning. Kendrick was completely stranded on the raised stage. He looked at his wife, who was backing away from him like he was a diseased animal. He looked at the flashing red monitors, signaling the absolute death of his stolen empire. And then he finally looked up at me. The arrogant swagger, the tailored suit, the unearned title of chief executive officer, all of it evaporated instantly into the cold hotel air. He collapsed entirely, dropping onto his hands and knees on the polished hardwood stage. He crawled across the floor, pulling himself toward my polished shoes like a beaten dog. "Dad," he choked out, his voice a pathetic, raspy whine that echoed through the microphone still resting on the podium. "Dad, you have to save me. Please turn the servers back on. You can have the company back. You can have it all. Just type in your administrative code and bring the network back online. If the stock hits zero, I am a dead man. The federal agents will lock me away forever, and the Russians will kill me before I even reach a prison cell. I am your son. You cannot let them do this to me." He pressed his forehead directly against the floorboards, practically kissing the tips of my shoes. He was openly groveling in front of the 18 most powerful executives in the country, in front of the flashing cameras of the financial press and the armed riot police. The complete humiliation was absolute and inescapable. I looked down at the shivering, weeping mess of a man cowering at my feet. I felt absolutely no pity. The love I once harbored for him had been systematically dismantled by his own treachery, burned away in the fiery wreckage of Evelyn's car, and buried under the forged documents he used to desecrate his mother's memory. I did not reach down to help him up. I did not offer a single word of familial comfort. Instead, I calmly reached into the inner breast pocket of my charcoal suit. I did not pull out a master decryption key or a mobile device to reboot the Titan freight network. I pulled out a single crisp sheet of heavy legal parchment. I unfolded it slowly, making sure the sharp creases flattened out perfectly. I dropped the document onto the stage floor right in front of his tear-stained face. I reached into my other pocket and tossed my heavy brass fountain pen, landing it with a sharp clink right next to the paper. "I am not turning the system back on Kendrick," I stated, my voice echoing like a final gavel strike across the chaotic stage. "Titan Freight is completely dead, and your fraudulent legacy is permanently buried with it. But you are going to sign that document right now." Kendrick wiped his running nose with the sleeve of his expensive suit and looked down at the paper. His bloodshot eyes scanned the bold, legally binding text. "What is this?" he sobbed, his hands shaking so violently he could barely touch the page. "It is your unconditional surrender," I replied coldly. "It is a full, legally binding confession. It details your direct involvement in hiring an underground forger to fake your mother's last will and testament. It outlines your authorization of a fabricated medical affidavit designed to strip me of my human rights. It confirms your explicit knowledge of the $50 million wire fraud to a Cayman Islands shell company and your direct complicity in Richard Montgomery's international money laundering operation. Read the final clause, Kendrick. It waives your right to a trial and enters an immediate guilty plea to all federal charges. You wanted to be the man signing the most important documents today. Here is your chance. Sign it and I will ensure you are placed in federal protective custody away from the Petrov syndicate. Refuse and I will personally throw you to the wolves waiting in the lobby." The brutal reality of his situation crushed whatever microscopic fragment of defiance he had left in his body. He was surrounded by heavily armed federal agents, his bankrupt father-in-law was receiving chest compressions on the floor, and his vicious wife was actively trying to slink into the shadows. He had absolutely zero leverage. The 18 executives standing behind me watched the pathetic display with cold, clinical disgust. They were bearing witness to the ultimate destruction of a traitor. Kendrick let out a gut-wrenching wail, a sound of pure, unadulterated defeat that vibrated through the silent ballroom. He reached out with trembling fingers and picked up the heavy brass fountain pen. His hand shook so violently that he could barely grip the metal barrel. He positioned the gold nib over the signature line at the very bottom of the confession. Sobs racked his body, causing his shoulders to heave uncontrollably. He was formally signing away his freedom, his reputation, and his entire life. The dark ink flowed onto the crisp white paper, capturing his total capitulation. He scribbled his name, his tears literally falling from his cheeks and staining the parchment. It was the most pathetic display of surrender I had ever witnessed in my entire life. He dropped the pen, letting it roll away across the stage. He stayed on his knees, staring at the floor, completely hollowed out and utterly broken. I leaned down and retrieved the signed confession, sliding it safely back into my breast pocket. The ink was barely dry before the final phase of my strategy materialized perfectly. A senior agent from the Federal Bureau of Investigation stepped forward from the tactical perimeter. He wore a dark windbreaker with the agency letters printed boldly across the back. He did not approach me to ask for a statement or clarify the situation. He marched directly past me and stood towering over my kneeling son. Kendrick Cole, the federal agent, barked, his voice cutting sharply through the remaining noise in the ballroom. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, forgery of federal documents, and corporate embezzlement." The agent forcefully grabbed Kendrick's arms, twisting them roughly behind his back and securing them with heavy steel handcuffs. The sharp click of the locking mechanism signaled the permanent end of his freedom. Across the stage, 2 other federal agents intercepted Meredith just as she tried to slip through a side exit toward the service elevators. She shrieked wildly, thrashing her arms and demanding to call her lawyer. "Meredith Cole, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, money laundering, and domestic terrorism," an agent stated firmly, completely ignoring her violent protests. They slammed her against the velvet-draped wall, clamping the steel cuffs tightly around her delicate wrists. She looked entirely deranged, her pristine white suit torn, and her expensive makeup ruined by tears of pure, furious rage. Down on the ballroom floor, paramedics were actively stabilizing Richard Montgomery on a medical gurney, but a federal marshal stood firmly by his side. "Richard Montgomery, you are under federal custody for grand larceny and international money laundering," the marshal announced to the barely conscious man strapped to the bed. The grand acquisition ceremony had perfectly transformed into a mass federal arrest. The flashing cameras of the financial press were no longer capturing a historic corporate merger. They were documenting the most spectacular and devastating corporate downfall in American history. The steel trap had closed completely around the entire family, and I stood on the stage watching them being dragged away into the flashing red and blue lights of absolute ruin. The air inside the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta was thick and suffocating. The polished mahogany walls and cold marble floors felt like a massive tomb designed specifically to bury the arrogant. I sat perfectly still in the front row of the gallery wearing a sharply tailored navy suit, watching the pathetic final act of this corporate tragedy unfold. Kendrick sat at the defense table looking entirely hollowed out, completely stripped of his unearned pride and fake swagger. Beside him sat Meredith, wearing a plain gray blouse that completely failed to hide the absolute venom running through her veins. When it was her turn to testify, she did exactly what a cornered predator does. She viciously turned on her own mate. She took the witness stand and immediately unleashed a torrent of calculated theatrical tears. She looked directly at the jury and painted herself as a terrified, abused wife completely subjugated by a tyrannical husband. She claimed Kendrick orchestrated the entire corporate takeover, the forged medical documents, and the massive wire fraud all on his own. She swore she knew absolutely nothing about the $50 million stolen from my retirement fund. I was just a pawn. She wept loudly, gripping the edges of the wooden witness stand. Kendrick controlled every single aspect of our finances. He manipulated me into signing complex documents I did not understand just to impress his father and save his failing career. She was actively offering his head on a silver platter, desperately hoping the jury would throw her a lifeline. She painted him as a ruthless monster to save her own skin completely, ignoring the undeniable fact that her signature was on every single fraudulent offshore account. It was a masterful performance of pure survival instinct born from pure desperation. But Meredith's carefully constructed web of lies was about to be violently torn apart. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a resounding thud. Every head in the gallery turned. Walking down the center aisle with the slow, undeniable grace of an absolute survivor was my senior legal counsel, Evelyn Pierce. She moved with a slight limp supported by a sleek black cane, but her posture was totally uncompromising. A stark, jagged scar slashed across her forehead, standing as a brutal, permanent testament to the fiery car crash she had barely survived. The entire courtroom fell into a stunned, breathless silence as she approached the prosecutor's table. Meredith's fake tears instantly dried up. Her face turned an ashen, ghostly white as she stared at the woman she had actively tried to incinerate on a public street. Evelyn handed a thick, sealed folder directly to the lead federal prosecutor. The prosecutor opened the file and immediately addressed the judge. Your Honor, the prosecution calls its final rebuttal witness and submits new physical evidence obtained through a secondary federal investigation. He pulled a stack of heavily redacted bank statements from the folder and displayed them for the jury. These are the encrypted transaction logs from a secondary offshore shell company entirely controlled by Meredith Cole, he announced, his voice ringing with lethal authority. They detail a direct wire transfer of $250,000. This money was deposited into a ghost account exactly 3 hours before a commercial delivery truck intentionally rammed Evelyn Pierce's vehicle. The prosecutor turned and pointed a sharp finger directly at Meredith, sitting frozen on the witness stand. The driver of that truck, who was apprehended by federal marshals 2 days ago, has officially confessed. He testified that Meredith Cole personally hired him to execute a targeted vehicular homicide to destroy the forensic evidence, proving she forged Yvonne Cole's last will and testament. We have the digital footprint, the burner phone records, and the financial trail directly linking the defendant to an act of premeditated attempted murder. The courtroom erupted into absolute chaos. Reporters scrambled frantically for their phones while the judge repeatedly slammed his wooden gavel demanding order. Meredith opened her mouth to scream a denial, but she had absolutely no voice left. The undeniable proof of her immense brutality was resting right in front of the judge. She had tried to kill a brilliant attorney to cover up her greed, and the fire she set had just come back to consume her completely. Kendrick sat rigidly at the defense table, entirely motionless amid the deafening uproar of the crowded courtroom. He did not look at the jury or the furious judge. He slowly turned his head and stared directly at the woman he had betrayed his own flesh and blood to protect. He looked at Meredith as if he was seeing her true face for the very first time. The expensive makeup, the designer clothes, and the fake high society charm had all melted away, leaving behind a terrifying hollow monster. He finally realized the monumental scale of his own pathetic ignorance. He had sacrificed a brilliant corporate empire, a multi-billion-dollar legacy, and the unconditional loyalty of a father who built a kingdom for him just to impress a venomous snake. He had willingly handed his entire life over to a woman who not only despised him, but was fully prepared to murder an innocent woman and frame him for the entire criminal enterprise. Kendrick did not scream or curse her name. He just stared at her with dead, empty eyes. The absolute crushing weight of his betrayal finally broke his spirit entirely. He had completely destroyed his own universe for a mirage. He knew there was no redemption left for him. He was completely alone, surrounded by the wreckage of his own monumental stupidity. He slowly turned his gaze away from his vicious wife and looked across the gallery, finding my eyes in the crowd. I gave him nothing. No pity, no anger, no forgiveness. He lowered his head, staring down at his handcuffed wrists, silently accepting the absolute ruin he had actively engineered. "Order in this court," the judge bellowed, slamming his heavy wooden gavel repeatedly against the sound block until the chaotic room finally fell completely silent. He glared down at the defense table with absolute judicial disgust. The sheer magnitude of the greed and malicious violence displayed in this courtroom is entirely unprecedented. You sought to dismantle a highly successful enterprise, defraud federal institutions, and execute a calculated murder solely to satisfy your own parasitic ambitions. The judge adjusted his glasses, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "Kendrick Cole, for your direct role in corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and the facilitation of forged federal documents, I sentence you to 15 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole." Kendrick did not even flinch. He simply closed his eyes, accepting his fate. The judge then turned his cold gaze toward the woman trembling violently on the witness stand and the broken man seated behind her. "Meredith Cole and Richard Montgomery, for your roles in orchestrating an international money laundering syndicate conspiracy to commit wire fraud and the premeditated attempted murder of a federal officer of the court, I sentence you both to 25 years in a maximum security federal facility." The swift, sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs tightening around their wrists rang out loudly, cutting through the absolute silence of the room. Federal marshals immediately surrounded the defendants, hauling them aggressively to their feet. Meredith shrieked frantically, fighting against the guards as they dragged her away from the stand. Richard Montgomery simply slumped in his wheelchair, looking completely defeated. I stood up from my seat in the gallery, adjusting my jacket as the marshals escorted my former family through the heavy side doors. They were disappearing into a dark, concrete reality they would not escape for decades. The legal war was officially won. But my work was not entirely finished. I walked out of the courthouse and stepped into the bright Atlanta sun, ready to take back the very stones of the foundation they had tried to steal. The heavy gray clouds over Atlanta finally broke, unleashing a violent torrential downpour as my town car pulled up to the imposing wrought iron gates of my Buckhead estate. The federal sentencing had successfully concluded, but I still had one final piece of trash to aggressively remove from my property. I stepped out of the vehicle, letting the freezing rain hit my face. The electronic keypad was still locked with the code Kendrick had changed, but that no longer mattered to me. I looked through the thick iron bars and saw the heavy front doors of my home swing wide open. Stepping out onto the covered portico was Richard Montgomery's wife, Meredith's mother. She was wearing a plush cashmere sweater, holding a crystal glass of my expensive bourbon, and looking entirely too comfortable in a house she did not earn. When she saw me standing in the pouring rain, her face twisted into a mask of pure aristocratic entitlement. "What on earth are you doing here, Garrison?" she shrieked, her shrill voice barely cutting through the sound of the fierce storm. My husband and daughter might be dealing with a temporary legal misunderstanding, but Kendrick gave us the legal right to manage this property. You are trespassing on private land. I am calling the police right now to have you arrested. She actually believed her own delusion. Even with her family completely dismantled and facing decades in a federal penitentiary, this ignorant woman clung to the pathetic illusion of her stolen status. She stood on the porch of the house I built from the ground up, sipping my liquor and demanding I leave my own land. I did not respond to her frantic shrieking. I did not attempt to reason with a woman actively drowning in her own manufactured reality. I simply raised my right hand and gave a sharp downward flick of my wrist. The deep rumbling sound of a massive diesel engine roared to life behind my town car. A heavy industrial excavator, painted in bright yellow construction colors, rolled forward on its massive steel tracks, grinding against the pavement. It bypassed the security keypad entirely. The massive steel bucket raised high into the air and slammed directly into the center of the wrought iron gates. The expensive electronic lock shattered instantly into a dozen pieces. The heavy metal doors were violently ripped from their stone hinges, crashing onto the paved driveway with a deafening metallic shriek. The pathway to my home was officially completely open. The woman on the porch dropped her crystal glass, shattering it across the stone tiles. She screamed in sheer terror as the heavy machinery forcefully cleared the path. Behind the excavator, 2 black tactical SUVs rolled smoothly onto the property. 6 of my private security contractors stepped out into the pouring rain. They marched directly past the demolished gates and up the stone steps, completely ignoring the hysterical woman. "Get out of my house!" she screamed, swatting wildly at the guards as they easily bypassed her and entered the mansion. Less than 5 minutes later, my security team emerged. They carried 4 massive designer suitcases packed haphazardly with her belongings. They did not gently place the luggage on the porch. They marched straight down the driveway to the very edge of the property line. With a synchronized heave, they launched the expensive suitcases directly into the flooded street gutter. The bags hit the deep puddles, soaking the designer fabric in filthy rainwater. The guards then returned to the porch and firmly grabbed the woman by her arms, physically escorting her off the premises. She kicked and wailed, demanding to call her lawyers, threatening to sue me for every penny I had. I stood in the rain, watching her stumble into the muddy street, her cashmere sweater soaked and completely ruined. "You do not have any lawyers left," I stated, my voice perfectly calm over the storm. "You do not have a company, you do not have a daughter, and you certainly do not have my house. Get off my sidewalk before I have you arrested for criminal trespassing." She fell to her knees in the flooded street, sobbing uncontrollably as the absolute reality of her complete destitution finally set in. I left her weeping in the gutter and walked up the stone steps into my home. The sudden quiet of the grand foyer felt incredibly hollow, but entirely necessary. The suffocating presence of the Montgomery family had been completely eradicated from the premises. I walked slowly up the grand, sweeping staircase, making my way directly to the master suite. The room was in complete disarray from Meredith's frantic packing before her failed airport escape, but I did not care about the mess. I walked straight to the expansive walk-in closet. Lying carelessly discarded on the floor was the emerald green silk robe I had purchased for Yvonne in Milan. I bent down and carefully picked up the delicate fabric. It was wrinkled and slightly torn near the hem, an insulting casualty of Meredith's blatant greed and disrespect. But holding it in my hands, I felt a profound sense of closure wash over me. The physical representation of my wives' memory was no longer being worn as a mocking trophy by a deceitful parasite. I gently folded the silk robe, smoothing out the creases, and placed it reverently on the edge of the large, pristine mahogany dresser. The toxic stain of the Montgomery family had been scrubbed clean from the very foundation of my estate. The house was finally a sanctuary again. I walked back downstairs to the formal living room where a large framed portrait of Yvonne rested perfectly above the marble fireplace. I opened a small wooden box on the mantel and retrieved a single stick of sandalwood incense, her absolute favorite scent. I struck a match, watching the flame flare brightly before settling into a steady, glowing ember. I blew it out gently, letting the fragrant white smoke rise in a slow, twisting spiral toward the high ceiling. The familiar, calming aroma quickly filled the expansive room, pushing out the stale, lingering smell of the intruders. I stood before the portrait, looking at the warm, genuine smile of the woman who had helped me build this empire from absolutely nothing. "We won," I whispered into the quiet room, the heavy burden of the past few weeks finally lifting from my tired shoulders. The sanctity of her memory had been fiercely protected, and the people who tried to destroy it were locked away in concrete cells for the rest of their natural lives. Just as the incense smoke began to dissipate, my encrypted mobile phone vibrated sharply in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was an urgent priority alert from Evelyn Pierce sent directly from her hospital bed. The message was short, but carried the ultimate finality of our corporate war. Montgomery Global just officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy liquidation. The federal asset freeze combined with the massive logistical debt from the failed Titan Freight merger completely crushed their operational liquidity. The bank is officially foreclosing on their entire commercial portfolio. The board of directors is liquidating every single physical asset tomorrow morning at a public auction to pay off their remaining federal fines. I read the text twice, a slow, chilling smile spreading across my face. The absolute destruction of their fraudulent legacy was perfectly complete. They had tried to steal my kingdom, and I had responded by entirely erasing theirs from the face of the earth. But seeing them bankrupt on a piece of paper was not quite enough to satisfy me. I wanted to own the very dirt they used to stand on. The public auction of Montgomery Global was not a standard corporate negotiation. It was an absolute merciless slaughter. I sat quietly in the back row of the federal bankruptcy court, watching intently as the legacy of Richard Montgomery was violently carved up and sold for scrap metal. Because the market was entirely spooked by the massive federal money laundering charges, no legitimate institutional investor wanted to touch their commercial real estate portfolio. The properties were considered deeply toxic. That allowed my newly formed holding company to swoop in and purchase their entire physical infrastructure for exactly 10 cents on the dollar. I bought their sprawling warehouses, their automated distribution hubs, and their offshore shell companies. But the absolute crown jewel of my acquisition was the Montgomery Global corporate headquarters. It was a gleaming 30-story glass and steel skyscraper sitting on prime real estate right in the heart of downtown Atlanta. Richard had built that massive tower as a monument to his own bloated ego. The day the deed officially transferred into my name, I did not lease the luxury office space or rebrand the pristine marble lobby. I hired the largest commercial demolition firm in the entire state of Georgia. I stood across the street sipping a dark roast coffee as the demolition crews strategically planted high-yield explosives along the primary structural support columns of the building. I gave the site foreman a single commanding nod. A series of deafening sharp cracks echoed through the city blocks, and the mighty 30-story fortress of Montgomery Global collapsed into a massive cloud of gray dust and twisted steel. I did not destroy it to build a new tower. I ordered the contractors to clear the debris, pour solid black asphalt over the entire city block, and paint bright white lines across the pavement. I turned a billion-dollar corporate empire into a flat, empty parking lot. 2 weeks after the demolition, the dust had finally settled over the city, but the wreckage of my family was still smoldering in the background. I was sitting at the heavy mahogany desk in my home office reviewing the architectural blueprints for a massive new logistics hub when my private cell phone rang. The caller ID displayed a harsh automated alert indicating an incoming collect call from the United States Federal Penitentiary in Atlanta. I knew exactly who was on the other end of the line, waiting in the dark. I pressed the screen to accept the federal charges, placing the phone on the polished wood and activating the speaker. The harsh metallic hum of the prison phone system filled my quiet office. Dad Kendrick's voice came through the speaker. It was a weak, trembling whisper completely devoid of any life or arrogance. He sounded like a broken ghost haunting his own vocal cords. The brutal, unyielding reality of a maximum security prison had clearly shattered whatever fragile illusion of superiority he had left. He had been entirely stripped of his custom-tailored suits, his expensive luxury watches, and his fake executive title. He was now just a number printed on a cheap orange jumpsuit surrounded by violent men who did not care about his trust fund or his former country club memberships. "Dad, please do not hang up." He sobbed, his breath hitching painfully against the receiver. "I know you absolutely hate me. I know I deserve to be locked in this concrete cell for the rest of my natural life. I know Meredith played me for a complete fool, and I let her destroy everything you and Mom built from the ground up." He was hyperventilating, desperately gasping for air as he cried into the dirty plastic phone. "I just want to see you. Please come down to the visiting room just for 5 minutes. You do not even have to speak to me. I just want to look at you and apologize directly to your face. I want to call you Dad one last time before I die in this miserable place. I am so entirely alone in here." The Russian syndicate put a heavy bounty on my head inside the cell block. The guards do not care if I live or die, or I am terrified every single second of the day. Please, Dad, I am begging you on my hands and knees to show me just a tiny fraction of the mercy I refuse to show you. I sat perfectly still in my comfortable leather executive chair, staring at the glowing screen of the phone as my son's pathetic weeping echoed continuously through the room. There was a time many years ago when the sound of Kendrick crying would have instantly driven me to tear the world apart just to protect him from any harm. When he fell off his bicycle as a small child, I carried him for miles. When he struggled in school, I stayed up countless nights tutoring him patiently. But the man crying on the other end of the phone was not that innocent child. The man on the phone was a calculating traitor who willingly handed over my entire life legacy to a parasitic, bankrupt family. He was a ruthless coward who authorized a forged medical document to lock me inside a psychiatric ward and strip away my basic human rights. He was a willing accomplice to the vicious woman who actively tried to burn my senior attorney alive in a crushed vehicle. He was arrogant enough to threaten to pave over his own mother's sacred grave just to satisfy his bruised, fragile ego. Every single ounce of fatherly compassion I ever possessed had been systematically suffocated by his own malicious, relentless actions. The silence stretching between us over the encrypted prison line was heavy, cold, and absolute. I let him cry. I let him feel the crushing, suffocating weight of the silent void, because that dark void was exactly what he had actively created. I felt absolutely no remorse. I felt no sorrow. My heart was completely sealed behind an impenetrable fortress of cold, hard truth. The frantic, pathetic sobbing on the other end of the line slowly turned into ragged, desperate wheezing. Kendrick was desperately waiting for a lifeline. He was waiting for the unconditional safety net that I had provided his entire privileged life to miraculously appear beneath him one final time. He wanted absolution. He wanted a few words of forgiveness to wash away the absolute terror of his harsh new reality. "Dad," he whimpered again, his voice barely audible over the loud static of the prison line. "Please say something. Please tell me you are still there." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany desk, and looked directly at the framed photograph of Yvonne sitting perfectly in the sunlight. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling the cool air into my lungs. "You are speaking to a man who built a global kingdom from the dirt," I stated, my voice perfectly steady and entirely devoid of emotion. "A man who protected his family from every single threat this world had to offer. But the man you are looking for, the forgiving father you expect to rescue you from the brutal consequences of your own treacherous actions, no longer exists on this earth. You murdered him the day you walked into my corporate boardroom and tried to steal my life." Kendrick's breathing stopped entirely. He realized in that agonizing frozen second that there was absolutely no redemption waiting for him. "I do not have a son," I said, the heavy words falling like solid iron blocks sealing his concrete tomb forever. "You are simply a federal prisoner serving a harsh sentence you entirely earned. Goodbye, Kendrick." I tapped the red icon on the screen, instantly severing the connection and cutting off his final terrified gasp. I did not hesitate for a second. I immediately dialed the direct administrative line for the warden of the federal penitentiary using a private priority contact number I had secured through my legal team. The warden answered promptly, recognizing my name. Warden. I said, my tone absolute and unyielding. Inmate Kendrick Cole just utilized his phone privileges to contact my private residence. I am formally requesting a permanent communication block. Restrict his access to my phone numbers, my corporate lines, and my physical mailing addresses. I never want to hear his voice or see his name cross my desk for as long as I live. The warden confirmed the permanent block immediately. I set the phone down and closed my eyes, letting the absolute silence of my home wash over me. The past was finally completely buried. The morning sun broke brilliantly over the private aviation terminal at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. I stood inside a massive state-of-the-art aircraft hangar that had been completely transformed into a global press arena. The space was packed shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of financial journalists, international broadcasters, and elite market analysts. Their cameras flashed relentlessly, creating a blinding strobe effect that bounced off the polished concrete floor. Behind me, parked perfectly on the tarmac, was a sleek, brand-new Gulfstream jet. I stepped up to the acrylic podium wearing a bespoke navy blue suit that fit like a suit of armor. I did not stand alone. Flanking me in a rigid, unified line were the 18 most powerful chief executive officers in the North American supply chain industry. The exact same men and women who had walked out of the Titan Freight boardroom with me just weeks ago were now standing firmly at my back. They formed an impenetrable wall of corporate royalty, projecting absolute unified dominance. I looked out over the sea of hungry reporters and simply raised my right hand. The deafening roar of the press corps instantly died down into a sharp, breathless silence. They were looking at a man who had just orchestrated the most spectacular corporate dismantling in modern American history, and they were desperate for my next move. I lowered my hand and gripped the edges of the podium, feeling the solid weight of the moment. The global supply chain had been holding its collective breath since the logistical blackout, and today, I was finally going to let them exhale. Over the past month, the financial world witnessed the complete and total collapse of two massive entities. I began my voice booming with clear, uncompromising authority over the sound system. Titan Freight and Montgomery Global collapsed under the crushing weight of their own parasitic greed, their toxic debts, and their catastrophic mismanagement. The market viewed this as a devastating tragedy. I view it as a necessary surgical extraction of an infected tumor. The journalists frantically typed on their devices, capturing every single word. The global infrastructure requires a flawless engine to survive, I continued. You have all seen what happens when that engine is abruptly removed. Supply chains paralyze, economies bleed, and entire industries grind to an absolute halt. I built that engine 30 years ago with my own two hands, and I legally reclaimed it to prevent criminals from driving it into the ground. Today, I am returning that engine to the global market, but under entirely new conditions. I gestured to the 18 executives standing behind me. Together with the esteemed leaders standing at my back, I am officially announcing the formation of a new sovereign superconglomerate. We are launching Vance & Cole Logistics. The name Vance is a permanent tribute to a brilliant fallen ally, and Cole honors the unbreakable spirit of my late wife Yvonne. The flashing cameras erupted again in a frenzied frenzy. I raised my voice to cut through the noise. Titan Freight is dead. Montgomery Global is buried under an asphalt parking lot. Vance & Cole Logistics will seamlessly absorb their abandoned market share by midnight tonight. The proprietary algorithm that runs this network is back online, vastly upgraded, and entirely under my sole unyielding ownership. I am no longer licensing my intellect to a board of directors. I am the board. We are establishing an absolute monopoly built on unparalleled efficiency, ruthless precision, and total transparency. The age of fraudulent corporate raiders is officially over. A new apex predator has entered the ecosystem, and we are taking absolute control of the global grid. The executives behind me nodded in perfect synchronization, signaling to the world that the industry had a new undisputed king. The power dynamic of the entire global economy had just been violently and permanently rewritten on my exact terms. I opened the floor for a brief question and answer session. The press corps erupted into a chaotic shouting match with dozens of reporters desperately vying for my attention. I pointed a steady finger at a young, ambitious financial journalist standing in the front row. He adjusted his glasses, gripping his microphone tightly, and looked up at me with a challenging, almost insolent gaze. Mr. Cole, the journalist, shouted, his voice echoing through the massive hangar. "You are 69 years old. In the span of a single month, you have systematically dismantled your own former company and overseen the federal incarceration of your only son and your daughter-in-law. You actively destroyed your own flesh and blood to save your business. With your family completely locked away and your age advancing rapidly, are you not too old to rebuild an empire of this magnitude from scratch? Does the brutal betrayal of your own bloodline not leave you completely isolated and vulnerable in this highly aggressive market?" A collective gasp rippled through the crowded room. It was a deeply personal, highly aggressive question designed to strike a raw nerve. The reporters held their breath, waiting for me to explode with anger or crumble under the emotional weight of his sharp inquiry. The executives behind me stiffened, clearly offended by the sheer audacity of the young man. I did not break eye contact with the reporter. I did not display a single ounce of vulnerability or offense. I absorbed the sharp edges of his question, allowing the heavy silence to stretch across the room for several long, calculated seconds. I wanted every single camera in the building focused entirely on my face. I stood completely still at the podium, projecting a terrifying cold calm. I slowly raised my hands and smoothly adjusted the knot of my silk tie, making sure every aspect of my appearance was perfectly immaculate. I leaned slightly forward, bringing my face closer to the microphone, and locked my eyes directly onto the primary broadcast camera lens, piercing straight through the glass to the millions watching around the world. "Age is not a vulnerability, young man," I stated, my voice resonating with deep lethal gravity. "Age is a highly sharpened weapon forged in the fires of survival." I built a multi-billion-dollar kingdom from the dirt of South Atlanta. I survived economic crashes, corporate wars, and the loss of the only woman I ever truly loved. You ask if I feel isolated because I share no blood with the people around me. Blood is nothing but a biological accident. Loyalty, respect, and absolute competence are the true currencies of a lasting empire. The room was so quiet you could hear the distant hum of jet engines on the runway. "I did not destroy my family," I said, delivering the final devastating blow with absolute chilling clarity. "I just buried the parasites. Now my life truly begins." I did not wait for another question. I stepped away from the acrylic podium, turning my back entirely on the stunned, breathless press corps. The 18 powerful executives immediately parted down the middle, creating a wide, clear path for me. I walked with steady, unwavering strides toward the gleaming black Gulfstream jet waiting on the tarmac. The new sleek silver Vance & Cole logo shined brilliantly on the tail fin. I climbed the boarding stairs with the effortless strength of a man completely unburdened by his past. A flight attendant waiting at the cabin door respectfully handed me a crystal glass of premium bourbon. I took the glass, stepped into the luxurious cabin, and did not look back at the cameras or the crowd even once. The heavy aircraft door sealed shut with a firm hydraulic hiss. The massive twin engines roared to life, shaking the very ground beneath them as the jet taxied toward the runway to conquer the world. The screen fades to black. If there is one final lesson I can impart to you, it is that your legacy is never defined by the people who share your last name. It is defined by the fire you keep inside your own chest. People will constantly try to use your love as a weakness and your advancing age as an excuse to steal the things they did not sweat for. Never hand over the keys to your kingdom out of blind obligation. Real loyalty is earned through mutual respect and absolute competence, not assumed by a biological birthright. Protect your foundation fiercely, and never be afraid to burn down a toxic bridge to light your own way forward. If you enjoyed my story of absolute corporate justice, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments how you would have handled such a monumental betrayal.